Okay, and now we should be. Oh wait, we're in we're in game session, and that is not what we want to be. Let's try. Yeah, let's try this setup. This is much better for what we want to do. Excellent. And let me put this in performance mode so I actually look at the right camera, which is here. Welcome everyone to Level 1 Adventuring. I am your host, your dungeon master, your person who will be guiding you through this experience. Wolfe Scott, welcome. This is Level 1 Adventuring, as I mentioned. It is a sort of variety stream focused mainly around tabletop role-playing games and sort of adjacent other properties around that hobby. And we run primarily 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons every Wednesday. We have an ongoing campaign. But we also do a few other things. We have sessions like tonight, where we do sort of more theory crafting, more tips and tricks kind of deals. Sometimes I will play a role-playing game, video game. Sometimes I will play a solo RPG. We just started the solo adventure in Numenera, Monty Cook's Cypher system. That should be up on here and YouTube now. So check that out. That was a lot of fun. That'll continue on into the future. But tonight, we are doing something a little different, something that we've dabbled in before, but we haven't fully committed to, which is talking a little bit more about character creation for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in particular. Oh, I should mention, follow us on all the things on Twitter, on Discord, Instagram, YouTube, and of course Twitch. All the videos will be reposted there, and if you join our Discord, you can talk to us, and it's where you get announcements, and hopefully that'll actually be a play-by-post space eventually. I'm still setting that up, but, we got long-term plans here. But this session is happening tonight in particular because one of our, I would say, arguably our most loyal fan, Mochi Fett, who is in chat right now. Mochi comes to, all of our games, even the solo games, just super involved with the channel, which I'm very grateful for, and is also interested in D&D and, role-playing things, but had messaged me and said, hey, do you have any tips for building Dungeons & Dragons characters? And I said, yeah, I got tons, but it's a lot easier to talk about them versus typing them. So I thought, let's turn it into a stream. So Mochi's here with us, so round of applause for Mochi. And we're going to talk about character creation, and we'll also, Mochi, I know that you said that you, well, I don't know exactly if you're actually trying to create this character to play in a campaign, or if you are sort of just creating this character in a vacuum to see, oh, of course, Mochi, of course. Mochi, you are always here to support us. I must repay the favor. So I don't know if you are creating this character for a specific campaign that you think is going to be running in the future, you have a character in mind, or you're just creating them in a vacuum. But I'm hoping that I can help guide you through the process, and I want to sort of tap into your brain as we go along this, and the purpose behind why you're interested in building characters. So I guess number one, first things first. Are you planning on building this character for a campaign? Do you have a game coming up, or is this more just you're interested in building a character and just want to see the process and, we'll sort of talk at it through that lens, or is this more specifically for a game that you're planning on playing? And I will let Mochi type a little heart out. And then if not, maybe I'll just riff. Who knows? We'll see. But I'll give him a second to type. Because there's a lot of different ways you can take this depending on if you are building it for a specific game, or creating this character to be in the solo campaign. You start with, okay, that is a good, okay, so a distinction that we should make. So the system that we're playing on, never played D&D before, fair. As I look at this camera here, the campaign that we're playing, the solo game, is a different system. So it's the Cypher system, so it works a little differently. And in that scenario, for creating a character that I'd want to introduce into the solo RPG, it would be more of a like an NPC, like someone that like you would name that would like kind of share, you know, a story that you created for that character, but would not like be a playable character, because the solo RPG is like the solo RPG, right? But you know, we can use some of that same juice to sort of create the 5th edition character. Does that make sense? Am I making sense? Also, I have a cough drop this time around, since last time I tried to do a stream, I was like hacking up a lung and needed a drink every 5 seconds. Got it. Okay, so let's just start one from scratch. Beautiful. A wonderful place to start. So when we're looking at a D&D character, and this is something that I had kind of mentioned, let's just open Pages. Yeah, I know. You were there when I was like practically coughing up a lung. I'm just gonna type some words here. So I'm gonna say add some text, and then I know this is probably gonna be really small on your screen, Mochi. So I'm gonna try and blow this up. Let's like, how's this? Is that pretty readable to you, Moch? Add some. I said test. Add some text. I could also maybe disable performance mode for a second to see like if this is, yeah, oh, that looks pretty visible to me, right? Can you see that? As long as you can read what I'm typing, since I'm gonna try to go like follow some sort of linear, somewhat linear fashion. Put on performance mode again. Yes, I can read the allergies or so bad this week. Yeah, I mean, I guess it has to do with the rain. I don't know. I'm not a weatherman. Maybe it's like kicking up some gunk in the air. But I'm surviving, as I hope you all are as well if you're in from New York. So, creating a D&D character from scratch. There's kind of two different ways that you can approach this process in my mind, or at least that I'm thinking of right now. And it really depends on your level of familiarity with the game and the mechanics, right? Because from one angle, you can tackle creating a character from more of a functional, mechanical perspective. So, like, what do I want my character to do? How do I want them to operate, right? And how effective do I want them to be at those things? Which, you know, is generally a mindset to adopt when you are a bit more mechanic savvy and you know how the game works, per se, and how you can, like, push the system in the favor of your character and, you know, get the sort of intent out of the play of the character that you want, right? Now, the other way to approach it is sort of divorced from that, and that is the more narrative creation of the character, right? So, like, what is the fiction of this character? What is the story that I want to tell with this character? What are the narrative beats, you know, that I want this character to resonate in play when I'm role-playing them? And although those two planes, right, mechanics and narrative, or some people call them fluff for the narrative, right, like the fluff, the fun stuff, and the crunch, you know, the nuts and bolts of the game. Although those things can bisect and ideally do, right, like you want a character that both feels narratively how you want them to play and then does that at the table, right? You want them to bisect. Obviously, your mileage will vary depending on like what brings you joy, personal joy in the game, what kind of table you're at, that kind of thing, right? So, but those are the two kind of ways that you can approach character building in my eyes, is like fiction first or like function first, right? But regardless of the mentality of how you approach the character, it is eventually going to narrow down into the same like three lenses in terms of like how the character is made up. And I touched a bit on this in the Numenera stream because I was talking about the differences between building a character for the Cypher system and building a character for 5th edition D&D, and how they both kind of have this three-part character building system. So Numenera, right, we talked about how it was your three character parts were your descriptor, your type, I think they call it, and your focus, right? So the descriptor is kind of like your character trait or personality. The type was sort of like how would I describe type? I mean, it's like class, but if you don't know what class is in D&D, then it's kind of a bad analogy. Type is, I guess, is sort of like your role in the game. And this also, I think, ties. And what I mean by role is sort of like when you're in a group of adventurers and with your party, like what is the function of your character versus the other characters at the table? Like, what are your abilities functionally from the game? And this also does inform some story aspects, right? And then we also talked about focus. Focus was purely sort of like a superpower-based thing. This is sort of like your abilities, which also bleeds a little bit into narrative, right? Because I think the examples I gave during the Numenera stream were like, my character has a focus which is all about their mind sort of like fusing with machinery, but there's also focuses that are like, I have fire powers, or I have electric powers, or I'm super strong, right? That sort of thing. D&D, so I should probably label these because it's probably going to get a little messy. In D&D 5th edition, you have a similar 3-part character process, but I would argue it's probably a little easier to wrap our head around because the cipher system is purposefully a little vague, purposefully a little abstract, because the cipher system is designed to apply to a wide variety of genres. So you can use the cipher system to play super spies like you can Lord of the Rings, like you can Star Trek, right? Like these 3 pieces are designed to be able to be broadly applied to any story you find yourself in, whereas D&D is sort of nailed down specifically into some variant of fantasy, high fantasy, sci fantasy, like when you're talking about Spelljammer, things like that. And so you can get a little bit more specific with your language, right? So the 3 parts of a D&D character, which are kind of going to mirror our Numenera counterparts here, are your background, which we'll talk about what all these are as we type them out. In the original book, I think in the original 5th edition book, they've gone through a lot of rewrites, or they're going through a lot of proposed rewrites because of a lot of well pointed out points that are people making about like sort of archaic holdover language, which isn't super like sensitive or progressive right nowadays. So the second aspect, which in most books would be quoted as your character's race, right? Wow, rave. What am I typing? So like if you're an elf, if you're a dwarf, if you're a dragonborn, etc., etc. But this has mostly in most people's tongues that I've seen been sort of substituted for ancestry instead. But it's the same, although the nomenclature is different, right? The function is the same. So it's like where your bloodline hails from, like what physical, and depending on the ancestry, you have like what metaphysical traits do you have because of your makeup, right? And then the final thing, I said I was going to explain as we go along, and then I totally skipped background and I dove into ancestry. But I guess I'll go back and do background. Background is like, it's a bit like your character's backstory, although I would argue that you actually need to have, you don't need to depending on your table, but you should have a bit more actual backstory, a bit more narrative than you have over your background. But mechanically speaking, in the rules of the game, the background is sort of like who your character was before they were an adventurer, right? And it's also who they are now they are an adventurer. It also informs what they do and what their purpose is now. But, it's like, were they a merchant before like their inciting incident, which began the adventure? Were they sailing the high seas? Were they a noble in a high court, right? So these will, of course, have gameplay implications, but they will also just sort of have story implications for your character and how they carry themselves and how they see the world and how the world sees them, which are all things that you'll want to consider during the game. And then the final piece, which is sort of the biggest, I guess you can say, the most influential part of your character, is your class. And the class, are there guidebooks, charts to help you pick all these qualities for newbies, Mochi asks. Yes and no. I would say, so when you're a new player to D&D and you're purely approaching it from a player's perspective, you're not planning on running games, you're not planning on being a dungeon master, there's only really one book you need, and that is the player's handbook, right? If you're not planning on running games. The player's handbook will teach you everything that you need to know about how being a player or character works, how your abilities function for your class, and like the action economy, all that stuff. That being said, at least in the original iteration, because I still think I have the first printing, it's not like it's not super intuitive. Like, it kind of gives you, like, there are sections for each class specifically, because like I said, the class which we're going to be talking about is kind of like the biggest building block for your character, where they're like, hey, if you just want to start the game really quick and you don't want to like dive into all the nitty-gritty character building stuff, like this background and like this ancestry for this class would like work well, and you can just start, right? But it doesn't really tell you why. You can infer why as you like look at the stories and like all the different options. It's like, oh, I can see why they might have suggested entertainer for bard, right? That makes sense. Or I don't even know if this is true if they wrote this in the book. But like criminal for rogue, right? Like you're like, oh, this all makes narrative sense and it works at the table. But it doesn't really explain to you why they're making those choices, just sort of like a given. I will say there are great third-party tools and third-party resources in terms of like guides over the years, because consider that 5th edition has been out for like what, I don't know, 10 years or something. Like, well, I've been in the city for almost 10 years, and I started playing 5th edition when I like maybe a year into moving here. So it's been around for a while. There have been just huge bodies of work that have been written by other people long before me. Oh, there it is. Oh, the first cough of the night. I'm gonna have a drink of water. Long before I've come around here to give like verbal advice, people have written stuff. So in that regard, you can find lots of great third-party supplements on websites like the DM's Guild, which is where third-party independent publishers will write and print their own content, and some of them are guides, which are very handy, although some of them are free, some of them aren't. They've also since released some starter adventures, which I do believe have some starter characters in there, and I think they kind of have like a basic rule breakdown too, so you're not like looking at the entire book, which can be very intimidating for new people. You kind of gives like the Reader's Digest version of the rules. Another thing you can do is, let me open up a new tab here, as I look at Ancestry.com, or Legacy.com, Ancestry.com. What you can do is type in, if you're like building a character, I still do this to this day, because there are some people who have really put a lot more thought into like the nuance, the nitty gritty of building characters than I have. If you type in like 5e, like any class you can think of, like Rogue Handbook, right? There are like independent writers who have written these extremely extensive breakdowns, and they have like their own little rating systems, like what options are good, really good for this class, which are okay, which are like bad, right? So, and I say bad with big quotation marks, because you have to understand when you're looking at something like this, like a handbook, although this is very useful because it tells you what you need to know and like how it works. Like it'll tell you like this is how sneak attack works, and this is what benefits a sneak attack for rogue, which is like really important. You kind of have to understand that all of these guides are approaching the game from a very mechanical standpoint. They're like, what is the best option for this character to perform optimally at the table? It has sort of like a min-maxy kind of mindset, which isn't bad. But one thing that I will say is that, you know, your characters should not, I shouldn't say should not, once again, this is all so subjective depending on how you enjoy the game, but they do not have to be strictly about being mechanically good at what they do. Some characters can be bad at things and still be very fun to play and very fulfilling to play narratively. And arguably, like, depending on how you design a character, they're gonna have some weak points and faults anyway. So it just depends on how much you want to skew into that. And also, like, also, why is this, like, little tiny web page breaking my computer? How much that really matters. Like, for example, if I would look at, like, a wizard spell list, right? Like, most guides are going to tell you to pick up Fireball and or Lightning Bolt when you can finally unlock them at, like, spell level 3, because they are very good spells. Like, I think the creators of D&D have gone to say that, like, Fireball and Lightning Bolt are actually sort of overtuned in strength versus other spells of a similar level because they're so famous and they're so iconic, and, like, you want to feel powerful when you're, like, throwing around a Fireball, right? So, like, from a purely mechanical perspective, taking Fireball or Lightning Bolt is smart to do. But, like, if your character, that's not their vibe, that's not their story, if they're, like, an illusionist or they like to talk to animals or, like, whatever, then yeah, like, pick a spell or an ability that might not be as functional but lets you live the character more true to, like, the vision of the character. But it's all about balance, right? If you pick a whole bunch of, like, useless but fun spells, then you're going to feel that sting eventually during the game, and I'm sure party members will too. And then, you might want to readjust. But so there are guides, there are handy things to use. But I would say, yeah, a lot of them are, like, sort of third-party developed, and you also have to consider the fact that most people writing them are looking at it from a, how do I make this character the best at what it does, not necessarily the most true to the vision of the character that you have. So it's kind of a long-winded explanation. So yes, you also said, sorry, I'm just seeing this, Chris Jericho throws fireballs. I don't want that. Fair, be your own wizard. Have your own goals. Maybe we all don't want fireballs, But speaking of wizards and rogues, all these things I'm talking about, that kind of brings us to what we're talking about, which is the third part of your character, which is class. So class is, it's very similar to type in the Cypher system in that it is your role, both in the fiction of the game and at the table. And what I mean by that is, like, are you a wizard? Are you a knight? Are you I'll just say rogue again because I said it before. So, like, these three things, obviously, just by looking at them, you think wizard versus a knight versus rogue. Immediately your brain is thinking of different ways these characters present and operate at a table, right? Obviously, wizards are going to be smart and they're going to use spells and they're going to be, wise and have magical insight. Knights are going to be strong and tough and have big armor and carry big swords and be able to fight monsters one-on-one. Rogues are going to be quick and nimble and cunning and stick to the shadows. Those all explain how the character operates at the table, but it also informs how you will probably portray the character, right? Obviously, there are tropes, right? There are sort of baked-in storyline threads, right? When I say wizard, immediately you're probably, your mind goes to Gandalf, And those characters exist, and they're true, and there's nothing wrong playing a character that leans into those tropes. But you also might want to play a character that specifically skews away from them for your own enjoyment, or because you've already built, like, 4 wizards. If Garrett, our current resident wizard on the stream right now, Garrett probably has 4 different characters made for every single class at any given time. He's, like, always making characters. So some of his characters are just so wildly different than what you'd expect. Like, I think he told me once about a ranger, which is kind of like Aragorn, right, from Lord of the Rings. He's like a hunter, archer, kind of. It's like, yeah, I made a ranger who's a Loxodon, who's like a giant elephant person, and just had this crazy backstory about this elephant archer. Like, you can go wild with it. You can go wide with it. But once again, that's your choice, and that will inform sort of the story and, you know, the functionality of the character. And then there's kind of like a secret fourth. We love a secret fourth. And that is the subclass. Now, the subclass of a class is something that in most cases you will not immediately need to be familiar with. So you'll see, let me open up a tab here. So let's look at a rogue. I'm going to use rogue example because they have a lot of abilities. So if we take a look at this is the standard 5th edition level progression chart for a rogue, right? So when you start play at level 1, this will kind of be the abilities that you can expect to have. And as you hit level 2, 3, 4, 5, you get more and more and more, just like, you know, playing any sort of video game. You level up, you get more skills. You'll notice that most classes around level 3, and some other classes are exceptions, some get them at 2, I think some even get them at 1. So in certain classes you may have to be immediately familiar with. Majority you can kind of cheat around 3 and think it through. You'll get something called like an archetype or an enclave or a school, or they're all named something different depending on the class. But what this essentially means is you are a rogue, right? That's like the capital C class, right? But the subclass is kind of like a specific variant of the class, a specific specialization, if you will, which kind of gives you more specific abilities that are tailored to that specific all archetype or alteration of the class. So for example, for rogues, three archetypes that I can think off the top of my head are the thief, the assassin, and the arcane trickster, which I think are the 3 standard that come in the basic D&D book, or like the D&D player's handbook. So all 3 of those, the thief, the assassin, and the arcane trickster, will all get these. They'll all get the same rogue stuff, except on all of these levels, which are notated with an archetype, right? These ones, they will get a specific ability, which is unique to that archetype, which no other archetype can get, right? So for example, thief rogues will get abilities that are specific to like climbing up buildings and jumping from rooftop to rooftop and being really good at like picking locks and opening doors, whereas an assassin will get abilities that are specific to like stealth and disguising and doing like huge amounts of surprise damage to like kill their target quickly. Arcane tricksters will get abilities that are related to being trained in magic, like particularly illusion and enchantment magic, so that they can combine their mystical abilities with their natural cunning and stealth to like confound enemies. And those are things that are specific to that subclass. So once again, it informs both the fiction of a class and the function of the class. Because you might imagine that if you're going to write an assassin character, it might be very different than if you're writing a thief character, right? It's just like the stories that you're telling and how they're going to interact with situations are going to be a little different, right? So those are kind of like the 3/3.5. These are the building blocks of any D&D character, and you will need to figure out what these are before play starts, you know, hopefully, and then build out from there. So that's where we're gonna start so far. Hopefully that is making sense. Now, we were talking a little bit before about how building a character in a vacuum, like if you're just kind of theory crafting a character in this scenario versus building a character for a group is different. And this is largely because, you know, when you are building a character specifically for a campaign, or, you know, in the efforts to tell a story, you are a cast of you are one character in a cast of characters. So ideally, you want to build characters that complement one another and play to each other's strengths while minimizing each other's weaknesses. to kind of give the party the best fighting chance at like defeating the bad guys and triumphing over all of their challenges and things like that. So depending on your play group, obviously this is going to depend on like whether or not you are playing with an established friend group of yours who all kind of know the game kind of well and know each other very well, and you can kind of talk this through, versus like maybe whether you're going to like your local game store and you're playing just like pickup games with strangers, right? Because you never really know what you're going to get there. But the idea of building a character that's part of a team, right? If you're thinking that through with like other people, is important, because although there is technically no rule, right, in D&D that's like you need to have a well-balanced party that like has a wide variety of skills and can help each other in a variety of scenarios. There's nothing saying that you have to do that, but generally it's smart. And there are opportunities for telling stories in which you don't do that specifically, right? Like, so for example, I would say the most important like type of character to have, right, in any given party is at least one person who has some access to like healing magic or defensive like support magic, because this is a game about fighting monsters and like going to very dangerous places and triumphing over evil. You're probably going to get banged up, you're probably going to get like dragon fire on your back at some point, and you're gonna hopefully have someone there who can help you counteract that. All the other roles, right, like can sort of be substituted. You can always have someone who deals damage, whether or not they're doing it with a bow or a knife or a spell, whatever. Or you can always have someone who's standing in front of all the squishy tiny people taking damage for them, whether that's like a dude in armor or like someone who is shapeshifted into a bear, right? Like all of those roles can kind of be substituted in different ways, but healing is kind of like the hardest thing to replicate across all classes. But once again, it's not a prerequisite. If you have a DM who is creative and has a lot of forethought, for example, like say you were playing, there's a pre-written adventure for the 5th edition called Waterdeep Dragon Heist, right? It's written all around the idea that your adventuring party are sort of like a ragtag group of, well, I guess it depends on how you're playing the story, but in my mind, they're sort of like a ragtag group that are, they're trying to uncover a hidden treasure in this big city. So it's kind of like a heist story, right? Like you're getting everyone who has a different skill set to help them break into different places and smooth talk guards and like fight through defenses and things like that. Ooh, excuse me. You could tell that story with, your classic combination of like rogue, wizard, fighter, cleric, and it will be well balanced and it will work. But there's also something really fun with maybe being like, okay, let's do a game where we're all rogues, right? Because like rogues are sort of like your classic like breaking and entering like criminal type class. It could be really fun to play a game where you're doing a heist and you're all different types of rogues, and you have to figure out like how to do the big score with like a very different skill set. But in that scenario, your DM might have to think through like, okay, well, how are these characters going to heal themselves regularly without having a character who has access to that power? Because that, if I just keep throwing fights at them and they have no real means to recover in between fights easily, that's going to feel really grindy and maybe unfair to them. So they might have to think of like maybe a cool magic item to give you, or like a cool NPC healer, or like, any myriad number of narrative ways to justify being able to make sure you all don't die often. But yeah, so building for a group is an important thing to consider. In 4th edition D&D, which is the edition that came out prior to this, they had what I felt was a really inspired kind of system, which once again was not a prerequisite by any means, but it was a sort of strategic device to get your players to thinking about more on how to be a team. where they sort of divided all of the classes into overarching groups, like sort of types. So you had defenders, which, as you imagine, like, you know, guarded people. They were like tough. They had strikers, which were the people that were tasked with like dealing damage and killing enemies. You had leaders, which, like we talked about, were like healing, support, etc., etc. And you had controllers, I think was the final role type, which these are the people who would like use spells or abilities to like affect the battlefield, you know, do things like create force fields and mind control and things that would like change the context of the fights and the scenarios to better align with like the party winning versus the bad guys, right? And so this concept was really novel because you could get a group of people who are like completely, you know, unknowing to D&D and sort of say, okay, like what kind of like, you know, what kind of character do you imagine yourself playing? Do you want to be like the big, strong, like burly, tough type who's like in the front taking all the hits? Okay, you should look at the classes that are labeled defenders. Do you want to be the person who's able to like change reality and like Doctor Strange everybody into submission? Okay, maybe you should look at all the classes that are labeled controllers, right? And I was a really big fan of this language. Now, when 5th edition rolled around, they kind of dropped this idea, and I think that was largely due to the fact that they kind of suffered a good deal of backlash in the creation of 4th edition, which I felt was kind of unwarranted, because I am a 4th edition apologist. I really liked 4th edition. I learned how to DM on 4th edition, so it is kind of like near and dear to my heart. Like, I played 3, but I learned to DM on 4. And a lot of people criticized it for feeling a little bit too video gamey. It felt like, you know, a lot of people were comparing it to like WoW, like World of Warcraft, which I'm not saying is not an apt comparison, right? I mean, it was different, obviously. You're playing on a, you know, board and you're rolling dice. But it did, I think, borrow a lot of ideas spiritually from those games. And this, I think, is definitely that, right? You know, like when you think about, I don't know if any of you have ever played WoW. I had my time. I've since hung it up. Yes, Mochi, you're right. WoW is inspired by D&D. So weirdly enough, when D&D was started borrowing ideas from WoW, people were mad, even though it's like, it's just sort of all borrowing from the same pool. But, you know, people are very specific about what they like, and they're very passionate. I feel like the 4th edition language I understand more. StarCraft Girl. Yeah, no, I mean, 4th edition, like, honestly, there are, for as much flack as 4th edition gets, there are a lot of people who still say the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide is one of the best printed Dungeon Master's Guides out there. Because of how accessible they made a lot of those ideas, and I would stand by that. I will say 5th edition, I do like, I would say it's my favorite edition, even beyond 4th, as much as I love 4th. So I do like a lot what they did with 5. But you can definitely tell that they took specific moves away from ideas like this, at least at the beginning of 5th edition's life cycle, which we will talk about because they're sort of skewing back in that direction. We'll talk about it. But yeah, it was definitely something they adopted and then dropped and now are slowly reintroducing. Also, StarCraft, you must construct additional pylons. That's like your I'm contractually obligated to say that whenever we talk about StarCraft. So that brings me to borrowing old ideas they had before. And I already had it opened, I think, on a different tab because I knew I was going to talk about it. Okay, so if you are new to D&D, or red alert, what was that? Oh man, the ghosts, right? When they painted a nuke on your stuff. Oh man, StarCraft, my heart. I was a big Blizzard kid. I played Warcraft. I played StarCraft. I was so nerdy. I learned how to play Warcraft 3. I learned how to use the little unit editor, and I would go in. This is so nerdy. I'm gonna really out myself here as like a Warcraft 3 like I don't know, super head, but like I would go into the character editor and I would make custom hero units, because you could, there's like a whole system where you could like make the design the characters and give them different abilities. I would make hero units and then I would place them. I think it was in the first Warcraft 3 expansion pack where they had hero units that were not bound to a particular faction. You could just hire them from like a mercenary hut that like you found as you walked along the map. I would put the custom hero units in the mercenary camps, so that like when I was playing a game against the PC, because I was like bored and I was just like home and I was, I don't know, a teenager, I could go to like the mercenary camp and I could hire my own custom created hero that I made and like make them fight with my force. It was so nerdy. I mean, I loved it. It was so cool. I was like, I'm like a little programmer. I purposely took computer class in middle school because I never sounded. That's really cool. You actually were like, I don't want to say forced because that is a cool assignment, but like, yeah, the Warcraft 3 editor was awesome. I honestly don't know how I learned. Like, this cannot be the same brain that I had when I was a teenager, because like I like self-taught myself how to make hero units, and now I'm like, I don't know how to function as a human. I'm trying my best. That's all to say, I could talk about Warcraft 3 for a while, but you were a child prodigy hacker. Yeah, maybe that's where all the inspiration from where Jason is coming from for the new Minera campaign. So this was like a 4th edition thing, right? So if you are new to D&D or you are a part of the 5th edition, play group, but you are not so familiar with what they're talking about for D&D 1, I think they're calling it. So D&D 1 is, like I said, 5th edition's been around for a while. It's been around for like almost 10 years. So like, I don't know. I'm not doing my math right. I moved here 10 years ago and I started playing 5th edition D&D at sometime near the beginning of that. It's been around for a while, which means they're probably due for some sort of refresher update, or like even 3rd edition, as beloved as it was back in the day, had a 3.5, right? So D&D 1 is kind of like the new step into 5th edition, like the ascension of it, right? It's still very nebulous as to what it is. You can watch videos of them talking about like what their sort of design philosophy is about it. And from what I'm understanding, and from the playtest materials that I'm looking at, which are some of the things we're going to be looking at here when we're talking about character creation, is they're not straying too far from the nuts and bolts of 5th edition. Like, they still want 5th edition they still want D&D 1 to function like 5th edition because people like it and it's a system that's working for them. But they want to like expand it and reiterate on it, and in some places redesign certain elements of it or update, right? So we don't know if it's going to be like a new game entirely, or if it's going to be like a sub-evolution of 5th edition with like new bells and whistles. There's like a lot there that we're still feeling through as a collective, and some people are excited about it. Some people have their reservations. I understand both sides, especially as they're really pushing for like more digital tool integration, which I'm not here to talk ill of, because obviously I am talking about D&D on a digital platform, and like obviously as technology advances and the hobby advances, they are going to become intertwined. I think there are some people who are kind of nervous that perhaps it's going to skew a bit too digital, a bit too video gamey, and it's going to exclude some people who want to play traditional tabletop, or make accessing those materials like for the tabletop a bit harder, like purely digital releases and things like that. Once again, this is all speculation, but just something to be aware of if you are in the D&D space right now and you see things, differences between 5th edition and 1. There's sort of like a new evolution of the game that is like being sort of prospected and play tested right now, actually. And these materials are from play testing. But this is something that they have introduced in the D&D 1 play test materials when we're talking about creating a character that exists within a group of characters, like as a team, as a party, which I really like and are sort of borrowing from this 5th edition idea set of like roles for the characters to help you choose who you are within the team of characters. But they sort of have it skewed a little different. Whereas this focuses very much on the mechanical function of the character, right? Like if you're a defender, what am I doing? I'm protecting my allies. I'm like the shield in the way, the sword between them and the monster. If I am the striker, what am I doing? I am dealing damage. I am focusing on stabbing or blasting or like whatever. These groups, which you can see here, these are the class groups from the D&D 1 playtest. These are actually more sort of skewed towards narrative and some function, but not like as, I want to say these are all strictly based off of battle functionality. Because one criticism that D&D 4th edition does get, which I once again will say is not unfair, it was a game that was highly revolved around the combat mechanics, and arguably every D&D edition does. When we break down, as much as we love inserting story and narrative into our D&D games, and I hope you do, because I enjoyed that as well, 90% of the rules, right, are based on how do I fight, how do I kill monsters, because that's the origin of the game. Like, that's like the lifeblood of the game, right? And so majority of the rule sets are designed around fighting. 4th edition kind of took this to an even higher degree, because you could tell by the way they wrote the books, it was very much written to be played on a grid with miniatures, moving little pieces like on a chessboard. And so I think the characters were designed to fit that style of play. Everything sort of was cast in the light of like, I am not only a character, but I'm playing as this little miniature which is moving along the board and doing things, right? So all of their character types were kind of broken into like those roles in terms of like a gameplay piece. Whereas these class groups, because 5th edition, of course, it has rules for how to teach you how to play on a grid, it is not so much bound to that. Many of the rules are widely applicable to playing other styles, including Theater of the Mind, which if you tune in on Wednesdays to see our live stream on this channel, that's what I do. I have no maps. I mean, I have maps on my side that I use for reference, but I'm saying I don't have any grids that I give the players. I don't have any physical pieces or digital tabletop pieces. It is purely a fiction that we're speaking into the ether together, you know, a grand improv, a yes and like making the game happen. And so that's where these class groups kind of live, and I find this very unique. So they kind of break them down into these different groups. So they have experts, mages, priests, and warriors. And while they kind of relate to some of these more combat-focused roles, there are some very distinct differences. So, for example, I think the most direct parallel, although there's already some muddying of the water here, is like warriors, right? So masters of combat who can deal and endure many wounds. It's kind of similar to a defender, right? Especially the barbarian and the fighter. So if you know about there's 13, or technically I guess 14 if you count the blood hunter, right? The sort of unofficial class that Matt Mercer made. The barbarian and the fighter are your like archetypical, I'm a big, strong Hulk, and I'm going to stand in front of everybody and like weather the arrows and weather the storm and beat them up, essentially, right? So those two under the warrior camp very much align with the defender role. Monk is kind of like a little bit of a split, because Monk, in terms of 5th edition D&D, like, yes, is a person who does fighting and gets up close and personal and punches people and kicks people, because they're kind of like a sort of like a kung fu, almost like Avatar, and some like some variants have like magical abilities, right? But they're sort of like a martial arts class, right? In 4th edition, they were more considered strikers, because strikers in 4th edition were kind of like glass cannons. They did a lot of damage, but they didn't have a lot of defenses, which is why you needed the defenders. Because, they don't really wear armor. They're just wearing like robes, and they're just like fast, and they hope they can dodge the hits. And then if they don't dodge, they're probably going to hurt, right? So you can kind of see there's a bit of a lifeblood connecting the warrior roles and the defender and striker roles, but they're kind of condensed, right? So basically, they're saying if you want to play a character who does combat, in the thick of things, just like Yoda in episode 3. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Yoda, dodging 9 times out of 10, but if you get him on that one, he's gonna be feeling it tomorrow. That's like kind of how the monk operated. So we're seeing some connective tissue here. Then we see, I'd say the most direct parallel are mages, right? So they say here, adepts of arcane magic focusing on utility and destruction. So they're citing the sorcerer, the warlock, and the wizard here. Wizard was most definitely a controller class in 4th edition. They had spells that put people to sleep, froze them in place, targeted their minds, trapped them in magical snares. Their whole role was like, I'm going to manipulate the battlefield under my will. Sorcerers and warlocks were kind of more strikers. Their magic was all about like hurting people, although they did have a slight controllery bent. But we're starting to see how they are relating. We're taking raw effects like I control the battlefield and turning this more into a narrative comparison. What's also interesting here is you see from this description here that within the 5th edition rule set, they're actually lumping these character types together from not only like their functions. So like, how do I describe it? Certain classes, no matter how different they are in 5th edition, some of them have similar or even the same features, right? So, for example, you'll notice that all 3 of these classes, they highlight this keyword arcane, because all 3 of these classes deal in arcane magic, in studying and understanding magic as an entity, And so in a game of 5th edition D&D, these 3 classes are most likely going to be looked at in your group as the person that everyone turns to when you come up to like that ancient scroll or that weird glyph written on the wall or that ciphered spell book, and it is the clue we need to progress forward with the story. All 3 of these characters are where the group is going to look and say, hey, help us fix this. Like, look at this, tap into your knowledge of the arcane, right, to help us solve this problem. Now, warriors here don't have like an underlined keyword that like gives them that same connective tissue, but from the description itself, you kind of understand why they're all here and what they have in common. They fight good. They do fight good, and you need people who do fight good. You when you're fighting monsters and villains and, walking statues and all that stuff, you're going to need people who fight good, and that's why they're here. So you can already see that they're actually dividing these classes up more so for their story benefit rather than their function, which I think is a smarter way to take it. And they've also done the double duty of using story fiction first as a way to bind these characters, but also giving them similar function, right? So like, if I build a party that is a ranger, a sorcerer, a cleric, and a barbarian, even if I build another party, which is a rogue, a wizard, a druid, and a monk, although those 8 classes are going to be very different, and those 2 groups are going to be very different, you'll still have one from each camp that will not only be able to fulfill a role in the story that helps progress it in a similar way, but also during combat and fights and challenges where most of the mechanics start rearing their ugly and beautiful head, like depending on how you look at it, right? So we see some connective tissue from controller to magic to mages, right? Then we have I guess priests are probably the easiest one to describe next. So, although I don't love the word priest for these characters. It makes a lot of sense for the class like a cleric, who is essentially a warrior priest. I kind of understand why it's on druid. Druid is like, you know, a nature spellcaster. They venerate the wilds and the natural world, or even some nature deity. So this does make sense. Paladin for me is the one that's like a little offshoot, because Paladin, in my mind, I always sort of equate them more to like a fighter type. But it's true, they heal people, and that is the connective tissue here. So you can see here, stewards of divine or primal magic, focusing on healing, utility, and defense. So these three classes, when I was talking about if there's one type of character that you don't want to exclude from your party, it's like a person who can heal and make sure that nobody dies. That's this group here. That is the priests. You kind of want a priest in your party. And those would equate to the leader role, right? In 4th edition is kind of like where that would connect. And then finally are the experts. So the experts, I'm leaving them for last because they're kind of the one that have no direct correlation to the 4th edition. Because once again, these 4th edition roles very much based off of combat utility, whereas these are more narrative. So they call this group, they call this group experts. And what is binding? What is the connective tissue for all these classes? They have the expertise feature. They all share this, no matter, even though these classes are very, very different, they all share the expertise feature. What is the expertise feature? The expertise feature is when you're building a character, which we'll get into as we continue the stream, part of your character creation process is that you will select what are known as skills, right, for your character. And these are not necessarily, you know, combat abilities or abilities that are granted to you from a class or subclass. Any character, all characters have skills, and all of these character types can even have skills that branch in between them, right? But they sort of describe something that you can do in the game to like affect the game world, right? So, for example, persuasion is a skill. So how good you are at sort of sweet talking and charming your way through difficult situations. Also deception and intimidation. So how you handle social situations, but also through like lying and deceit or outright, strong arming your way through it. Things like stealth, sneaking around from place to place, sleight of hand to be able to pick locks and like pick pockets. Things like nature and survival, understanding, tracks of beasts and different wood lore and plants you can eat and can't eat. These are all skills that allow you to interact with the world and may give you benefit for being really good at them and being able to like take advantage of them. The expertise feature specifically makes a character twice as good at any skill that they have expertise for, right? So it's kind of like saying, even this paladin, he might be really charming. He might have really high charisma. He might be able to sweet talk his way through a difficult situation, but he will not be as good as the bard, right? Who probably has expertise in persuasion, which like doubles its effectiveness and makes him much better at manipulating like the social currency of his or her environment. So this is sort of the most interesting new group to me because thematically, these three characters are very, very different. We talked about how kind of similar in DNA the barbarian and fighter and monk are. They're all just trying to punch people. Priests, they're all, even though these characters are very different, at the end of the day, they're all trying to heal and support their people. Mages, sorcerer, wizard, warlock, they're all casting spells. But the experts, like a bard, a ranger, and a rogue, are very different archetypes of character. A bard is also a magic user, but they're using like poetry and song and dance and expression to like manipulate the world, and they're very charming and alluring. Rangers are, once again, they're like your Aragorn types. They're rooting around in the mud, and they're like trailing beasts, and they're shooting arrows over long distance and like trailing through mountains. And then, of course, the rogue is like your sneaky, subtle, pickpocket, locksmith kind of character. So, thematically, they don't have very much in common uniting them, but they all would, what was that word? The sound I just made. It was like will and wood at the same time. Would. They all do have that shared DNA of being able to interact with the environment, the world of the game. Yeah, thank you for phonetically sounding it out, Moch. They have the ability to affect their world through their skill set a lot more effectively than the other classes. So I really like this. This is probably one of my favorite things I've read from the D&D 1 playtest so far, because it is giving players a better understanding of where they fit in the dynamic of their friend group or their play group, and sort of giving them sort of like a guidepost to being like, if you've never played a game before in your entire life, this is how you're useful. And this is like, in the fiction of the game, this is what you would be doing to like help your friends survive and complete their missions and complete their quests. So super awesome, and I hope we see more of this moving forward. But I guess this would be a great opportunity, Mochi, to sort of, because you are inspiration here for this. This page really helps out. I agree. This is a great little tap into the D&D 1 playtest here. Because you're sort of the inspiration for our session here, if you're looking at these 4 groups, Kara said, Bingo, first time chat. Hey, what's up? What's up, Bingo? Bingo was the name out. Thank you for chatting in. Where was I going with this? Oh, yes, Moch. You're sort of the inspiration for this stream. So if you were, we're talking about if you were making a D&D character. So you're looking at these 4 types. You're seeing experts, you're seeing mages, you're seeing priests, you're seeing warriors. What instantly jumps out at you in terms of like, what is the role of the type of character that I would want to play at a table? What sort of like, if you wanted to sit down and play with your friends, what do you think would be the role that you would lean towards? And this is, once again, we're making this in a vacuum. When I'm playing with friends, which is, once again, this is a fallacy right to begin with, because I'm usually the dungeon master, so I don't get to go through this process. I'm like writing the story. But, oh, my brain just stopped. It's recalibrating. Normally, because I have a really close-knit group of friends that I play with, we could normally have a conversation where it's like, oh, like, I haven't had a chance to play as like a fighter in a while. Like, I want to be the fighter. So like, if I already had a fighter character, maybe you could play X, Y, and Z. Like, you normally can have a more dynamic, organic conversation, or even create multiple characters. That's another thing I like to do too, is like maybe have like 2 in my back pocket, and then I show up and I'm like, I'd like to play this one, but if this one doesn't fit the vibe, what's that meme? I'm glad you're trying to defeat me with the power of friendship ball, but I'm literally the devil from the Bible. So that's what it sounded like in my brain. I could show up with like 2 characters and be like, this is not the vibe. And then, we could like decide as a group which one is better. Okay. I'm torn between a bard, a ranger, or a priest only because I love healing, but bards and rangers seem more like a character I would like. Okay, Mochi. Great insight. Excellent insight. Because, and this is another very interesting, even further amount of nuance that this table kind of gives us. Because while this category of character, the priest, does primarily focus on healing and defense, they are not the only characters that can do this, right? Like I said, 5th edition was created with this idea, not in its outset. So the characters aren't as tightly bound to these categories as they were in like 4th edition. So actually, interestingly enough, both the bard and the ranger have healing and support capabilities in their kit natively. Now, I would argue, and this is why this class grouping is interesting to me. I do see why Paladin is here, like I said, even though I would consider them more of a fighty class, because Paladins are kind of like holy knights. In my mind, I would always associate a bard with more of a priest class type, because they have a lot of healing abilities. Bards are primarily a spellcaster with a huge amount of support power. In fact, in the original 4th edition, Archetype Stormlight here, bards were leaders. bards led the party with their songs that healed their party members and bolstered their courage. They did also have spells that like controlled the battlefield, because when you think of a magical, song, a singer, yeah, they'll probably have spells that like, control minds or like, do weird spooky things. But they also had a ton of healing and support powers. Now, rangers, interestingly enough, they are not primary healers. Rangers are definitely first and foremost designed as experts in this regard. I would also argue they're definitely also a bit of a fightery type, because in the 4th edition they were considered strikers. They were about dealing damage, and in truth, a lot of the ranger abilities do skew towards a more fight-centered bent, but they are actually what the game considers what are they called? Half casters or 3/4 casters, I forget what it's called. So they actually do get spells as they level up, and some of those spells are healing spells. They're not like as intense as like what a bard or a cleric or a druid would get, but they do have abilities that like cure wounds, where they can lay their hands on another creature and like mend their wound shut. They have some powers, I think, where they can restore health with like magical berries that they can conjure. So not as healing centric, but can heal in a pinch. So I would say if you are liking the idea of being able to heal, but also are really enjoying the sort of, the fluff, if you were talking about the fluff versus the crunch, the fluff of a character, then I would say a bard or a ranger is probably a good way to go. And I would say, depending on how heavy you're skewing towards fighting or healing, I would say fighting more ranger, healing more bard. But also consider, and this is the other thing you have to think about the story that you want the character to tell. Because a ranger, right, someone who lives out in the wilderness, well, I mean, I'm relying on the most basic tropes for these characters. You can, of course, tweak these and change these stories to suit your taste. But when we think of our archetypical ranger, we're talking about someone who like lives in the forest, climbs trees, swims through streams, wrestles boars with their bare hands, can fletch an arrow with their bare hands to strike down their quarry, versus a bard, who is someone who is poetic, they're artistic, they're alluring, the cool thing about bards is like their magic, although you could probably write, that your bard studies magic, I think like in the way that 5th edition really writes about them is that like, because an inherent part of the lore of magic, is like speaking, magic words or things like that. Bards are just so artistically gifted that like the words they speak or like the movements they make, their art creates magic, right? Like it like ripples throughout like the force of creation, if you will, the metaphysical force of creation. So their art like replicates magic. And so, those are like two very different types of people that you might want to portray. And like, you're obviously probably going to role play and carry yourself a little differently at a table if you are embodying someone who's like a ranger versus someone who's a bard, Okay, so hearing me ramble on, Moch, are you feeling strongly one way or the other? As I probably pan out of camera, I can't really see where I'm at because I have my camera turned off. We feeling strongly one way or the other? Also, I have this 5th edition character sheet here pulled up. This one's already filled in a little bit. I'm going to erase it. You'll see the character's name is John Ralphio. So, for a summer, I worked at a game store in Brooklyn, and I taught kids how to play D&D. I was like their camp counselor. I was like their D&D camp counselor. It was cute. Sometimes it was an incredibly stressful job, and I'm not mad about not being there, although sometimes being with the kids was really cool and magical when they like got really into the game. But this was like one of my kids character sheets that like I opened for tonight, like to like, I was like, oh, I have a free character sheet, I can just edit it. And then I saw John Ralphio and I was like, oh my god, this was my student's character whose name was John Ralphio. And just so we're all clear, he named his character John Ralphio when he met me because him and his friend kept joking that I was secretly John Ralphio. I think it was because my hair was like super large and in charge at that point. And I mean, I went with it because, I mean, they're but weeb babes. Sometimes they got a little, that joke got a little stale, personally, for me. But, you know, it was cute. We had fun. We had a good time. So yeah, I'm going to erase all the information here for Jean Ralphio, while Mochi, you can tell me if we want to start looking at how we would build a ranger versus how we might build a bard. And then we can talk more about that character building process. As I am erasing all these numbers, don't mind me. Ba-ba-da-ba. If not, if you truly can't decide, then we can leave it up to like a die roll. We can let fate be our guide, as is wont in the D&D universe, right? I won't erase all of the text here because some of... Oh, I have look. Oh, I have look above. I don't know what you mean by that. Oh, I have look above. It's a good sentence. It's a fun sentence. As I delete. Okay. Okay. This should leave us pretty much blank. Oops, I responded to you. Did you? Did you tell me what you wanted to make and I can't see it? But Bard's a racing mode character I'd like. Mochi, I'm gonna let you figure this out. I see you plugging through it. No, it's okay. I know you came right after work, so you're probably a little sleepy. We can also pause and like pick this up at another time too. You know, I'm not opposed. If you're like super sleepy, we can like take this session by session. Because not only is this, I'm sure, useful information for you, but if other people are new to D&D, they'll like it as well. And maybe that'll benefit them to have it in chunks. Who knows? But yes, I do see, but Bards and Rangers seem more like a character I would like. So I saw that you're saying Bard or Ranger. My sentence was erased. Bards. Bards sound exactly like me. Love it, Moch. I do love Bards. They're probably my favorite class they're like my soul class. Like, if I were a D&D character, I would be a bard, right? Like, I trained as an actor and a singer, and, like, I would be a bard. But, like, whenever I play a character, I'm usually something a bit more sinister. Like, my trope, I cannot get away from this trope. And I don't want to, because I love it. But it doesn't matter what character I make, which is rare, because, once again, I'm usually the DM. But when I make a character, my trope, no matter what it is, like, I'm usually the character who was, like, painfully wronged in their past. And so now I study like some sort of dark and forbidden magic or like fighting technique so that I can fight fire with fire. Like, yes, I know the darkness so that I can defeat the darkness. That's like every character I've ever had. My first character ever was a sorcerer named Othric the Wild, who was like raised by a coven of witches. What else? I had a rogue whose like family and best friend were like murdered, so he learned how to talk to ghosts so he could like track down his like family's murderer by like talking to ghosts. It's always something like that. It's, you know, that's always, but like, so maybe one day I'm just gonna have to make a super metal bard. It's like, I will use the power of forbidden song to defeat my enemies. All right, so we know we're a bard. It's a great place to start. And in fact, we can type in 5e bard. And this will emo at heart, lol. Who are you? I think a better question, bingo, is who didn't hurt me, you know? There's just so much pain inside me. No, I'm being dramatic. But, not really, but maybe. Okay, so this is the Bard at a glance. This is a Bard from level 1 to 20, all of the abilities that they're going to get. Now, this isn't something that you really have to concern yourself with. If you look at this entire table, you are going to be very overwhelmed. Right, yes, that face right there. You will feel that way. The only thing we really have to focus on here is level 1. And really, not even this part yet, because I still want to talk about other parts of the character first, like their ancestry and their background. But why it's important to probably look at this a little bit is because these little things here on top of the class features, this kind of talks about the ability scores and what is important to a character. So if you've ever seen any D&D tropes, or I should say tropes, memes, or like, Stranger Things, like anything like that, you're probably going to see some reference to the ability scores, which are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, right? These are the building blocks of your character. This is sort of like, how would I describe this? These are the building blocks of your person in terms of like how their body and their mind is constructed, how strong they are in certain realms of their physical and mental person. And although some of these ability scores, and in fact all of them to a certain degree, are important no matter who you are, certain classes, certain character classes will naturally benefit and want more of one ability score versus others. So, for example, if I am, let's say, a barbarian and my job is to crack skulls and like split people open with my battle axe, I'm going to want a ton of strength because that is what's going to determine how good I am at like opening people like I'm a can opener. Versus I might not want to be... Oh, thank you for telling us what the form says. It's blurry. I can try to make it a bit bigger. Does this help at all? It's hard to see because I can't see what you can see. So it might be like a little wonky to like flip back and forth through this size, but okay. So as a barbarian, I might want a ton of strength, but I might not care at all about how smart I am because they're not paying me to read books. They're paying me to beat up the people who read books, right? Whereas if I'm a wizard and my entire shtick is that like I pore over the arcane library every night to like learn badass spells, I'm gonna want a lot of intelligence, but I'm not gonna need any strength. I'm gonna be a little scrawny. I'm gonna be a little scrawny guy, and I can probably get broken in half by a strong wind. But that doesn't really matter because, once again, if we're building a well-balanced party that has all of our little class groups, there's already going to be someone there who is bigger and stronger to, like, fill that gap, right? So the thing you want to know about bards is that, and this is where we start getting into some nuances about 5th edition that can get a little tricky for people. So bards are inherently spellcasters. Spellcasters, as fun as they are, and they are fun, they're my favorite archetype to play. They are a little trickier, just by nature, because they have spells, and that is something you have to pay attention to and learn how to use, right? And they can be a little more complex than other things. What's important to know about spells and spellcasters is that depending on the type of spellcaster you are, their magical power actually comes from a different stat. So not all spellcasters are going to want to have their minds built the same way. Sounds just like me. Yeah, there you go. So for example, we talked a little bit about intelligence for a wizard. If you're a wizard, the whole... And I should mention that how, like, all of these stats and, like, how they affect the characters are, like, written into their lore, right? So, like, for example, the wizard shtick is that they are the most learned. They go to, like, magical college, and they read their spell books, and their brains get really big, and their big brains help them do big magic, right? That's, like, their shtick. So they want intelligence. Whereas a character like a cleric, for example, one of the priest classes, their magic is all about their intrinsic connection to their god and like their divine realm and their spiritual connection to the divine and like the celestial powers. So their magic is all rooted in their wisdom, like their knowing, their like their instinct. They're like, this is just I'm just the channel for this force that is communicated through me because I am a servant of this deity. And so all of their magic is fueled from their wisdom, right? So that's like a kind of a different makeup. Bards, as we discussed, their magic comes from their art and how, at deft and adept they are at telling their stories and making their scenes happen, and that is what creates their mystical abilities. And so all of that is actually based off of charisma. Are you given a number that you have to divide into each category? Yes. Yes, you are. And here we go when we're talking about more nuance. So we'll go 5th edition ability score calculator. So this is... Here's like a random tool that you can find online. First one I clicked into when I went into Googs, the old Googs. So yes, you do have a number that has to be divided into each category, right? Now, how you get those numbers are going to be very different from playgroup to playgroup. And what I mean by that is, in the olden days, in ye olden days of the D&D, way before my time, actually, although I have played in games that have used the system because it is a holdover from a different time, you would actually, like right now, we're sort of designing the character from a very... I'm sorry, I have like a hair on my eyeball, and it is driving me nuts, and I can't find it. Okay. You would, like right now... We're creating a character from a very fiction-first perspective. We're saying, who are the person that we want to be? And then we're making all the numbers and all the function stuff make sense for that, right? In old school D&D, you did it the opposite way. You would actually randomly roll on dice. Like, you would go down the line, like, okay, roll a random number for strength. Roll a random number for dexterity. Roll a random number for constitution. And that would be your score. So it didn't really matter if you came in and you were like, oh man, I really want to be a badass wizard. Because if you rolled like a 20 for strength and then you rolled like a 12 for intelligence, your character number, was not going to help you be that wizard. You could still do it, but you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. That being said, the game played very differently back then. Characters died very quickly. It was almost like a meat grinder. Like the whole point of the game was kind of like, it was almost like a challenge. Like, how deep can we go into the dungeon? How long can this character last? How many games will they go before they die? That sort of thing. Whereas nowadays, the hobby has kind of evolved into a sense for most players that we want a strong story, and we want our characters to survive and continue to tell those stories, so they sort of persist longer. And so that's why I think the rules have kind of changed in such a way where there's a lot more freedom. Like, you're kind of given a lot more agency over where your numbers go, because where the numbers go actually helps you make the character you want to play instead of letting like fate decide for you, right? So that all being said, right, that was sort of a long preamble to answer your question. So in the olden days, you would randomly roll, you had no choice. Now you do. But even still, play groups are very divided on how they should handle this, and everyone has their own... Most people have their own take on it. Some people still randomly roll for stats. However, most DMs who let you do the random roll will let you roll all of the numbers like in a vacuum, and then choose where you're assigning those dice, right? So it's like, I might roll an 18, a 13, a 17, an 8, a 10, and a 16, right? But those aren't assigned anywhere yet. Then I can look at those numbers, and I can say, because I want to play a bard, right? Because I know I want to be a bard, I'm going to take that 18 and I'm going to plug that into charisma because I know I need high charisma. And then you could do the same for the other stats in, according to their relevance to you as a character. That's one way to go about it. Some people don't like this method because obviously it leaves a lot to random chance, and you can get in the awkward or sometimes unfair or unfortunate scenario where certain characters in a play group just develop better than others. I've unfortunately been in games, like this is way back in the day when I played 3.5. I played a lot in college, and I've definitely played in games where like my stats were like kind of middling to like some were bad, and I played where like someone rolled crazy good stats, and there was just always sort of like a point in the night where I always felt that I was just sort of like this person's sidekick, because they're like kicking ass and I'm like doing okay, but they're like head and shoulders above most of the play group. And that's not the best experience sometimes, because ideally you want everyone feeling strong and empowered and like a hero, because that's what this game is. It's a hero fantasy, right? So, you kind of want to make sure that everyone gets their moment in the spotlight and feels useful and powerful. So, yeah, the dice roll, and so people have made variations on the dice rule where it's like, okay, roll a bunch of randoms, but then you can maybe skew a couple numbers here and there, so everyone's like roughly on the same playing field. Da-da-da-da-da-da. You could read article upon article about how people have iterated on this particular method because it is like the first method and people like it, but it also is the one that leads to the most swinginess, and that is something that a lot of play groups try to avoid, I think. I do, at any rate. In fact, I try to avoid it so much that I will normally opt for... Oh, Candy, hey, what's up? Good to see you. Candy is my cousin, who is also on Twitch, has her own channel, and she's popping off. So, please, hey, her. So, please go see Candy's channel. Plays tons of games all the time. I'm seeing her pop up on my feed all the time. So give her a follow, give her a look. And thank you for joining us tonight. We're just building a D&D character with our friends. So my brain just got derailed. I am usually so sensitive, we'll say, to making sure that the party's well balanced that I will opt for sort of a more modern, quote unquote, modern approach. It's something that's been more implemented in like more recent iterations of the game, where they will use something either called point buy or standard array, right? And so let me see what the fifth edition 5e standard array. So what the standard array means, what are the numbers? I always forget the numbers. Okay. So standard array means when you start a game, everybody gets these numbers here. 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, 8, right? So it doesn't matter if you're playing the barbarian or the bard or the ranger or whatever. You get these same numbers and you choose to plug them in where you want them to go for your character. Now, that is to say that these are not your final numbers, because there are certain things in the process of building your character, which we're talking through, which may change them. Like, the easiest example is different ancestries in the default rules have different inherent bonuses. So, like, for example, a dwarf, in classic D&D lore, are strong and hardy. So they will typically have a bonus to their strength scores and their constitution scores because they're tough and they're mighty. So these would be like the standard numbers you would plug in, and then you would add whatever you would get for being like a dwarf on top of that, which would give you like your final numbers. In more recent developments in sort of like the D&D community space and like the TTRPG space in general, kind of how we were talking before, how people are trying to move away from like the race nomenclature and they're trying to use ancestry to sort of make it more inclusive and open, and which is all great. They have rightly, pointed out that having certain ancestries having inherent biases towards certain physical or mental attributes is kind of weird, and may be pushing into like some strange territory if like reflected into real life methodology and mentality. And so Wizards has gone on in subsequent books to sort of make addendums to that and say, you can, if you want, if your character vision aligns with the original vision of these ancestries. So like, yeah, if you want to say that your dwarf is like strong and tough, you can use the regular dwarf bonuses that are like to strength and con, and that's fine. But let's say maybe you're playing a different kind of dwarf. Maybe your dwarf was raised in like an underground enclave of scholars. You can kind of have the freedom and the variety of saying, okay, these normal bonuses that I get to strength and con, maybe I want them instead into intelligence and wisdom, right? And this does a couple of things. Number one, it gives players, full control over the narrative of their character, which is great. And number two, it really opens up the options in terms of like how the relationship between ancestry and class, because when we're like how we were talking about these guides, these handbooks. So if I go to like 5e Rogue Handbook again, that's actually, well, yeah, I was going to use the Bard, but that's kind of a harder example to use. The Rogue Handbook, let's say. You'll see they actually rate the different ancestries for like how good the ancestry is for that class. I'm wondering if I passed it up. I click on this one thing, I was going to find it. Okay, and I didn't. Regardless, we'll just, oh wait. No, I lied to you. I'm a dummy. Oh no, right here, there's a tab. Haha. Rogue Races Breakdown. And my computer is betraying me. Oh, no, it's not. I'm getting a pop-up. Regardless, okay, scratch it. Oh. I had a lag spike is what it was telling me. That's probably why. This is all going under the assumption that you are using the standard ability score arrays for the ancestry. So, for example, an ancestry like an elf, who is naturally lighter, faster, more nimble in the traditional lore of D&D, would make a better rogue, because rogues are reliant on their dexterity and their speed and their nimbleness, right? Which may make some people not want to inherently choose different ancestries other than like elves for a rogue. Because mathematically speaking, the elf gives them an advantage, right? Which all is not wrong. And it makes sense if you want to play a character that is like really good at that rogue thing, but it does mean that it sort of pushed certain ancestries into certain pipelines for certain classes, which like narrowed down the variety and the diversity of characters that you saw at tables, right? And that's part of the fun of being able to make your own character. Like, and there's nothing stopping you from like saying, okay, I want to make a dwarf wizard, even though I don't get a natural bonus to intelligence, right? Because over the course of a game, you're going to level up and you're going to get skill points, and you are going to be able to make your intelligence high, and even higher than a different ancestry that started with an inherent intelligence bonus, right? But it still means at the beginning of play, when you're starting your career off as your adventurer, you are kind of at an inherent disadvantage in comparison to other ancestries, which is just unfortunate, right? Because I'd like to imagine that anyone can do whatever they want, both in the game and like as a player, I want to be able to make whatever character I want to make. So that is all to say. So these numbers are the standard array, but they are not your final ability scores. And depending on the groups that you play with, those extra numbers that get added to these, right, are either going to go to dedicated stats if they're kind of playing with the rule set where certain ancestries get only particular stat bonuses, or if your play group is using the updated rules, the expanded rules, where the ability score bonuses can go to anything no matter what ancestry you are, then you have a lot more flexibility over where those final bonuses go and what eventually these numbers become. So that is standard array. It is these numbers and these numbers specifically plugged into these points on the chart that you then build from. Now there is, and that makes sure that everybody is, once again, the point of all that being everyone is on a level playing field from level 1, and there's no like random dice rolling where someone's really strong and someone's really not, right? Now there is one other variant to the standard array and rolling archetype, and that is called point buy. Now, how point buy works, Mochi, and this is probably more akin to what you were thinking when you asked, are you given a number that you have to divide into each category? This is more so along those lines. So you will see that this chart right here starts every stat off at an 8, right? This is pretty much typically the lowest that a stat will go for a player character. This is because if you look at like 10, right? The number 10 in a stat is considered just middle of the road, bum average ability, right? Like if you look at a stat block for a commoner, like a farmer, like a peasant, like a regular, degular person in the D&D world, all of their stats are 10. They are just as average and as milquetoast as they come. Nothing extraordinary about them. So the 8 means you're a little below average, right, in whatever ability score that's in, which does a couple of things for you. Number one, having a lower than average score is a role-playing opportunity, right? Like, if you say that I have an 8 in charisma, right, I am below average in charisma, what does that mean for your character? That can manifest in many different ways. Maybe I have an 8 in charisma because I'm like a bookworm wizard and I never really developed my social skills. And so when I'm interacting with people, maybe I use really complex words and I try to make up for it with my big brain, and I end up ostracizing people, and they don't. Regular degular was the first thing I understood this entire time. I like to mix in the local tongue, the local flavor into my my D&D description. So I'm trying very hard here. Yes, I also feel bad because you jumped in like halfway through, so there is a bit that you missed. But hey, that's the beauty of the VOD. You can always go back and watch it. We love a good local flavor. Oh my God, the Pittsburgh flavor. You get down to Permane Brothers, I'll show you some Pittsburgh. This is a very Brawlic convo for us. Now you're throwing in some New York there, bingo, with Brawlic. We're just You got to start somewhere. I think I'm breaking it down. I think I'm busting it down. I think it'll all make sense at the end. I hope anyway. This is the only kind of language I understand. Well, thank you. I appreciate your support. I'm trying. Luckily I have all these tools that like make things a little bit easier to describe, but where were we? So if you have an 8, once again, we use that example as like, maybe I'm a super smart wizard and I don't have any social skills, right? You could also maybe describe an 8 as like, what if I'm like a orc fighter, and my charisma is an 8 because I am like gruff and I'm rough and I don't really like talking to people unless I can sort of sneer at them and like kind of boss them around. Maybe I don't have a very likable personality. I'm strong and I'm tough and I'm capable. Maybe I'm not a people person, So it gives you a role-playing opportunity. But what it also does is when it comes to point buy, right? Taking a lower number, taking an 8, actually gives you more points to use to buy better numbers elsewhere. You'll notice that even in the standard array... Kitty, where's Piper? Where'd she go? I don't see her. She sneaking? I missed her. You'll notice that even in the standard array, they give you an 8 by default. So even the standard array assumes that you're probably going... Oh, she did the big jump? But she's not on her thing. She be in sneaks. The standard array even assumes that you're going to have a slightly lower than average stat somewhere because most people are very good at some things and they probably have a little weak spot in others. Of course, you can write out that weak spot at your option with point buy. But you'll see here, like, so on this calculator, you'll see that at the bottom of my table here, it says I have 27 points to spend. I should mention that this is not a 1-for-1 conversion. So by saying I have 27 points doesn't mean I literally have 27 points to divide amongst all these stats, because there's a bit of a sliding scale. You'll notice here for strength, for example, if I buy 1 point, I spend 1 point. I buy 2 points, I spend 2 points. So it's a 1-for-1 conversion. When I start going higher, okay, 11 is still a 1-to-1 conversion. 12 looks like still a 1-to-1 conversion. Then we have 5. Yes, once we get past the threshold to 13 to 14, you'll see we jump from 5 points spent to 7 points spent. So we're spending now 2 points for everyone. And then higher once again. Crowned Ruby is followed. Crown, thank you so much. I didn't even know we had an extra person watching. I appreciate you being here. Please chat in if you'd like as we talk through these crazy things. Can anybody send me? Oh, Candy, crushing it. We're getting friends from all across the internet. Yes, join us. Become part of our I mean, I want to say D&D cult, but like, isn't that what everyone's afraid of? Like the whole satanic panic. Which, by the way, D&D is not a satanic cult. I promise. Wink, wink. As I get pulled off of the channel. But you will see, the more points that you spend, you will actually have to spend more than a point for point value. So you can't just divide these 27 evenly across all of them, because eventually you will run out of points before you can max everything out. And that's done on purpose. Do I know exactly what that conversion rate is off the top of my head? No, I'm not a math guy. I studied musical theater, which is why I use this calculator, which does it all for me. But when you are... So what is the benefit of point buy then versus standard array? And I'll tell you. I'll tell you right now. Point buy is like standard array in that it ensures that everyone has the exact same amount of points to spend. No one can start the game inherently stronger or better than anyone else. So it levels the playing field. But musical theater major, weird. I know it's not written on me at all with my over the top mannerisms factors for actors. Oh my god. I remember being in high school. And I remember being short tangent. I remember being in our music guide too. I am a music guy. I am. You can look at me teaching myself guitar and singing songs on the internet, on my website. Thank you, Candy. Candy also sings. Our family is very musical. So we have a lot of sangers in our blood. We have a lot of bards in our blood, you could say. Candy sings me all the time. Look at all this wholesome energy emanating from chat right now. Thank you for bringing in these wholesome vibes. All these exclamation points. And when I was in the high school, I remember they put me in like, I was always bad at math. Like, just, I was never a math guy. And I remember like they placed me in some algebra course like my first like couple weeks in high school. And I remember going, and I had no idea what was going on. I just stared slack-jawed at the chalkboard for like a week or two, like right in between that time where I could, shift my schedule around. And I eventually spoke to, I don't know, whoever was in charge. We didn't have counselors then or, whatever. But I'll say, hey, I don't think that I was meant to be here. There has to be some mistake because you're putting letters in my math now and it doesn't seem right. So then they put me in, I forget what the name of the math class was. It was like fundamentals of math or something like that. And it was like literally for grade school children. It was so simple. And I mean, like, I didn't have any trouble then, right? Like knock on wood. I'm not a math guy, but I can do like basic addition and subtraction. But it was also just sort of the funniest class to be in my life because it was taught by this guy, bless his heart and soul. His name was Mr. Shipley. And he was just the kindest old man who was like, talk about wholesome vibes, like radiated such positivity and just like care for like all of his students. But like, I think he knew that if you were in this class, you either were like legitimately very bad at math and needed like a lot of help and support, which he gave, or he like knew that you were like bad at math, but like you also didn't care and he also didn't care. So he just kind of let me kind of hang out. Like, oh man, there would be days I had back in high school, Candy can attest, I had like really long scene like hair, like I had like a one big chunky bang which was straightened. I straightened my hair. I was a different beast. I was built different in high school. I had one big chunky bang that like hung over my thick black frame glasses. And I was so moody. I didn't like want to be there, and like he knew it and I knew it. But he wouldn't force me to be there. But just like the wildest shit. Like I would just like prop my like hands up like in my face with like my math book open and like just kind of nap sometimes. And I don't know if he knew and didn't call me out on it, or like my sheet of brown hair, which obscured all of my features, disguised the fact that I was taking a quick little Z in between periods. But he like never called me out on it. He just passed me to pass me. So thank you, Mr. Shipley. You are a great person who allowed me to progress my life, but I will say now that I'm looking at these D&D charts, you have failed me in the regard that I now need calculators to tell me how all of this works. So full circle. But once again, back to the original intent of the point buy. So the point buy, what is it designed to do? It is designed to make sure that all the characters are on the same playing field when they are creating their characters, so it's not random like the dice. However, it allows for you some nuance and some little tweaks that would not be available to you in the standard array. So say, for example, the standard array was like, 15, 14, I think 13, 11, 10, or 12? 12, 10, 8? High school math didn't allow calculators and college math requires them. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I needed a class just to learn how to use the TI 81, the TI 80 or whatever. Like, now I maneuver through a smartphone like it's an extension of my own body, which is degrees more complicated. But yeah, there'd be numbers on a calculator that like they look like they were hieroglyphics. To this day, I don't know what operation or function they're supposed to handle. I do know that I could spell boobs and then tilt the calculator upside down, which was pretty sick. But other than that, I use the calculator on my phone all the time. Yeah, no, that is true. Calculator phone still saves me to this day. So like you can see here, that's literally all you need though, right? So like you can see here, you can actually build. Oh, bingo! You're like flexing now. I studied calc. Okay. I love how all my math teachers said I would need algebra on the real world. Jokes on them. Matrices do not belong in math. I can't tell if you're advocating for math or fighting against it. It's gross. So you can see that you can actually build the standard array in point by. You can actually use all 27 points and end up with standard array. But at my option, I could choose to say, you know what? I actually don't care if my bard is as smart, but I do care that he can take a few more hits and needs a bit more constitution. And it gives you a slightly larger amount of wiggle room into how your stats play out and affects your characters. So I guess we should talk about specifically what all of these stats do. And that will help us understand a bit more of why they're important in the game. We talked a little bit about charisma already, so we'll start there. Maybe we'll start there and then go back to the top and work our way down, since it probably would make sense to go from top to bottom, but we already started at the bottom. Started at the bottom, now we're here. Okay, so sorry. That was... Sometimes I can't stop my brain before it makes sounds, and that is a me problem. So charisma, what is charisma? We talked about how charisma is for bards. It is their means by which they cast spells, because their spells are derived from their music and their magic, their music and their art and their storytelling. So they need a powerful charisma to be able to cast powerful spells. But what is charisma in game terms? Charisma for me, and as supported by the rules, but if I were to use my language to describe it, it is my force of personality. If you take a look at charisma here in the stat sheet, you can see, we talked about skills earlier, like all the different little powers that a character has. All of the skills are governed by stats, right? So they all kind of link together. So naturally, the stats that you have higher, the ability scores you have higher, will make your skills better. You can see that charisma is related to persuasion, which we talked about, being able to smooth talk and sweet talk people. It is linked to deception, which is about lying and deceit and subterfuge. It is connected to intimidation, being able to talk down to people and talk them into doing things you want to do. It's also tied into performance, which makes sense for bards, being that they need to be able to like make art, right? So being able to perform well relates to that. So charisma is your force of personality. It's your social currency, which is like interesting when you think about it, because you can have a high charisma and be really charming, or you can have a high charisma and be really intimidating. Like, being very charismatic in the game doesn't necessarily translate to being like very sociable and well liked, although it can if that's how your character is written. But it's really just like how larger in life your personality is. Do people see you and know you, and like, do you affect them with your presence and your words and things like that? So that is charisma in a nutshell. In gameplay terms, what does this relate to? If you're not a spellcaster who relies on charisma as your spellcasting attribute, which are actually a high amount in the game, Bard is obviously one of them. Sorcerers are actually also charisma based, and that goes into their lore. It's different, like why their charisma is different from bards, right? Like sorcerers aren't using music for magic, right? But it is still based into charisma. And also warlocks. Warlocks are also charisma based. Ooh, excuse me. Charisma based casters. So that being said, if it's not their magic, it is their social skills. It is, if you have a high charisma, thank you, Bingo. I've been like dying the past couple days. Luckily I have a whole bunch of Swiss Alpine herbs to protect me. We'll see how that goes. So if you have a high charisma, your role in the party should be, yes, thank you, redeemed hydrate. Whoa, both of you? Both of you redeemed hydrate? How long does that mean I have to sip? How long does that mean I have to sip for? What, you want to count me down? Should I just start chugging and see where we stop? That might be fun. Where are we sitting at here? How much have I drank today? I've been all right. I'm gonna keep my eye on the chat, so please don't choke me to death with water. Hmm? Hmm? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh. We started at the 11 o'clock marker, and we're now down to 5 o'clock. Yeah, I'm alive. I'm probably far more alive than I was before that began, because I actually now have water inside of my body and not coffee. Oh, that was running on coffee in a dream. Oh, but my stomach is mad. Oh my god. That's gonna... Damn, you drank 4 hours? Yeah, I just chugged 4 hours of my life, of time, for you. For you. What am I, a circus seal? Yeah, I mean, here I am on the internet talking to people on through a camera, so kind of. But anyway, wow, that was a lot, and I'm going to feel it. I'm going to try not to keep my mind in, but thanks, I guess, for forcing me to hydrate. Okay. Charisma, force of personality. If you have a high charisma, if you're a character who's based off charisma, your role in the party to some degree is being able to talk to people, being able to swindle the guard, being able to schmooze with the nobles, being able to intimidate the henchmen to tell you the big bad's evil plan, right? You need these kind of characters. Well, need's a strong word, but it benefits the party to have characters which are powerful in this regard, so that you, when a social situation comes up in D&D, in a D&D campaign, you can kind of take the lead and hopefully usher your party into victory. When I say social aspect, I'm going to take a little tangent here because it is an important thing to talk about. When you look at the D&D campaign, we're talking about a D&D adventure, and when you're talking about designing characters, which is what the stream is about in a very high-level sort of way, the D&D designers, right, Wizards of the Coast, have gone on to say that their mentality for designing D&D adventures and campaigns kind of boils down into 3 narrative beats, 3, categories, right? So there is... combat, which I mean is very straightforward. There's a large part of this game which revolves around fighting monsters, fighting villains, battling evils, right? So that's one element of the game. Exploration, which is discovering, whether that's secrets and clues or hidden doors or the lost pendant hidden in the Duchess's, cupboard that reveals that she's secretly a member of the evil cult, or, even if it's physically exploring, being able to track across a wild wilderness to discover the ancient temple that's hidden in the mountains, to travel through a thick enchanted wood, while surviving. So exploration is a pillar. And then the last aspect is social, right? So being able to do all those things we just talked about, to interact with the people in the world and gain information and benefit from them. So when you're creating your character, that's also maybe an important thing to keep in the back of your mind is what parts of the game really appeal to you. When I say combat, exploration, social, what do you as a player want to be able to do the most? What do you want to excel at? Does combat sound really fun to you? Does being able to go toe to toe with like a goblin lord sound awesome? Then you would probably skew a little bit more towards the combat side of things, which if we're looking at this handy chart that they gave us for how they're now classing the new, the classes, how they're grouping the classes together in the one playtest, you might say, oh, okay, maybe I would want to skew towards a warrior because they're literally masters of combat. If you are thinking like, oh, exploration sounds really cool to me, I want to know how to uncover secrets, maybe something like a mage would be awesome for you because they're all about using, they understand mysteries of arcane, or maybe something like a ranger or a rogue if you want to talk about physically exploring places like the wilderness or being able to sneak around buildings and things like that. But if you're talking about the social pillar, when you're talking about being able to converse with NPCs and gain information and affect the narrative by like your force of will and personality, then you're going to want to skew towards characters that have high charisma, people like bards, people like paladins, or even sorcerers kind of double up on this role like we talked about. So that's like another interesting thing to think about, are those three pillars and like where you fit, where your interests as a player fit within like combat, exploration, social. So we talked about charisma. Great. Grand. And that's very important for bards, which is sort of our example character that we're using to build out. Going back to the beginning. Strength. This is pretty straightforward. Strength is, how are them muscles? Flex them for me. Give them in the chat. Because that is like what the stat relates to. It is, how much gear can you carry? Can you push over the portcullis gate, which divides you from the fleeing bad guy? Can you hoist up the big metal box and throw it aside, when you're trying to maneuver through the underground chasm? And also, when you're wielding a big, heavy weapon, like a giant two-handed sword or a warhammer or whatever, can you... the Ochiometer. Yeah, exactly. Pump a few more points into the Ock. How you can physically use those big, heavy weapons. Skill-wise, it relates to athletics, which is everything we just talked about. How good you are at climbing, running, swimming, feats of strength, your physical capabilities are all related to strength. Not inherently, since we're talking about bards, not inherently useful to bards. However, we did talk a little bit about how each bard kind of has a... Oh, no, that's not the one I want. We did talk about how each class has a... I broke everything. I didn't mean to. How every class has a subclass. So even bards have like different kinds of bard types that are like nested within the overall bard stripe. There are some bards. There are some bards. Oh my! There are some bards near and far. There are some bards that may benefit from like a better strength. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking of, there's a particular bard. The bard archetypes, the subclasses, are called colleges. It's like, what bard college did you attend, right? There's one bard college called the College of Valor, I think. So that's like when you think of like, a bard who like blows into a mighty war horn before charging into battle with like the rest of his comrades, right? That is like the College of Valor bard. And they benefit from weapon skills, being able to fight more effectively, in in the fray. So they may particularly benefit more from strength. But other bards that focus more on their mind or their magic may not. So there is a bit of a play here depending on where you're developing your character long term. Dexterity, another one of the physical skills. Dexterity is related to strength in that it is about your physical capabilities, but as opposed to raw force, it's more about fine motor skills and control. It's about how swift you are, how precise you are, how quick on your feet you are. It is your reaction times. It is all of those things rolled into one. You'll see here skills that are nested underneath dexterity are acrobatics. So can you tumble? Can you flip? Can you contort, right? Sleight of hand. Can you pick a pocket or maybe subtly plant an object or evidence on someone without them noticing? And stealth. So being able to hide and sneak around and not be seen from enemies. By enemies, I should say. Dexterity, as we're also talking about hand-eye coordination and precision, dexterity also governs most ranged weapons. So things like bows and arrows, crossbows, even throwing a dagger. There are some weapons that you throw with strength, things like spears or like tomahawks and like axes, right? Whereas there are some weapons which you throw with precision and hand-eye coordination, things like daggers, darts, shuriken, things like that. So dexterity is where that skill is like primarily based in. Then you have constitution. So constitution is the last of the physical ability scores. It is the last of the hardy, I should say, or I'm using the wrong word, the body skills. But I just used hardy, and that's why I was thinking of this. So constitution is exactly that. It is how hale and healthy and resolute and fortified your body is. If you have a lot of constitution, this directly affects your health, which if you're used to playing video games or any sort of fantasy role-playing game, it's the logic follows that if someone hits you with a sword, it hurts you, it deals harm, right? And those are usually expressed in like points that go down until you hit 0 and you're dead. Constitution directly increases that. So the better constitution you have, the more health you have, the more hits you can take, the longer you can last in a fight before you pass out or worse. It also affects things like if you are like bit by a snake, does the poison overtake your body? If you are spelunking into a cavern filled with contagious fumes, are you inhaling it and are you being affected by it? So it's really just about your body's ability to resist pain and other untoward influence, right? There are no direct skills that relate to Constitution, but saving throws. Every stat pretty much has a saving throw attached to it, which saving throws are like defenses, right? So it's everything I was talking about here, resisting poisons. A saving example for a saving throw for dexterity would be like jumping out of the way of an explosion. An example of a saving throw for strength would be like maybe not being knocked down off of your feet by like a very heavy force, right? So every stat will have a saving throw attached, and some may have skills. Constitution has no skills, but does have saving throws. And also health is just really important to have in general, so it's a pretty important stat for everyone, although some classes will benefit from it more than others. For example, if you're playing a warrior or a type that wants to get up in people's faces and like hack and slash, you're probably going to want more Constitution because you are putting yourself in a position where your health will be shredded, as opposed to someone like a wizard or even like a ranger or a rogue who's usually on the outskirts of the fight or on the sides, using ranged attacks, using spells. So you're kind of leveraging your distance as opposed to your health to your benefit. Now we have intelligence, so we move away from the physical stats and we get into the mental stats. So there's 6 stats, 3 for each, physical, mental. Intelligence is your raw intellectual power, your book smarts, your big old brain, Um, this directly is tied to your knowledge of the world and of situations, how you think through things, your rationale, your logic, and how learned you are in a sense. It doesn't mean you have to narratively like be learned in like a scholarly sense. Like you don't have to like go to school, but you know, you're probably self-taught or you're taught to some degree that you have your wits are pretty sharp. Important for spellcasters. Pretty much mostly wizards are based off of intelligence, but you'll see that there are a lot of skills that are related to intelligence. So Arcana, your knowledge of magic and magical secrets and mystical, supernatural goings on is related to intelligence. History of the world. You know, this could be applicable in many situations if you need to know like the lineage of the bloodline of a noble house, if you need to know the cultural traditions of a land that you're traveling through. Things like that are all related to history. Investigation. This is you like finding clues. You know, this is your ability to like put together puzzle pieces and form hypotheses. You know, like if you're like rummaging through the research notes of a mad scientist, you know, trying to figure out what magical invention they made that's going to be like the next doomsday device before it goes off, investigation is probably going to be helpful. Maybe also Arcana too, because I said magical, but you know, investigation is you like putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Nature. What is your knowledge of plants, animals? Are they poisonous? Are they dangerous? Are you able to communicate them? Communication is more animal handling. This would be like more raw knowledge about the animal in question. So this is like your wood lore, we'll say. What kind of trees are good for what kind of building? What kind of berries are good for what kind of food? What is the weather like in a particular tract of land they should prepare for? So this is a really good skill for like rangers, for example, or druids, who are also like a very wilderness-focused class. And then religion. So this is actually knowledge of specific religions and religious practices, which is important in D&D because in most assumed D&D fiction, although certain settings and homebrew settings may be different, like the gods are real, you know, like celestial forces are real. So knowing about them and what they like, what they don't like, what they have power over, what they don't have power over, who their natural allies and enemies is useful to know. And like how their followers and their cults might operate. But also religion gives you knowledge on monsters that are related to like religious archetypes. So, you know, things like angels, things like devils, demons, things like undead, which could be made from like a dark religious ceremony. That gives you knowledge on that, which can always be useful. So that's intelligence in a nutshell. And then we talked about wisdom a little bit before too. So if intelligence is like your raw intellect and your raw understanding, your wisdom is like your innate knowing. It's your inner knowing. It's your if intelligence is practical knowledge, then wisdom is more like essential knowledge, like innate knowledge. Wisdom is important for some spellcasters, particularly the priest classes, at least 2 out of the 3, the druids and the clerics. But it can be useful for anyone for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into when it comes to skills, because there are a lot of important skills that are bound to wisdom. So number one that I kind of accidentally lumped into nature, but it is different, animal handling. So whereas nature, as I mentioned, is like knowledge of animals and maybe their ecology and like what they eat and how they hunt and like, you know, if I read a book about animals, nature, that would be that skill. Whereas animal handling is like, I'm in front of a bear right now. It's not in a book, it's in front of me. And I want to convince it to not eat me, you know, or like distract it long enough that I can escape. Or maybe there's a wild horse. and it would be beneficial for the party to have it to be able to ride it, but I have to like tame it or like hop on it and like break it and convince it that I can, mount it. That's animal handling. So anytime you're interacting with an animal, and so it's kind of almost like, it's almost like persuasion or intimidation or deception for animals. So that makes sense. It's like a social skill that you have that applies to creatures that don't have the same level of sentience or understanding that a humanoid creature would have, if that makes sense. I think that's the best way to describe it. Insight is a very interesting skill, especially, like Dr. Dolittle. Yes, and also no. It's so weird because D&D makes a very, there's actually a spell that you can learn as a character called Speak with Animals, right? That is like that is like literally I can look at a frog and be like, how are you today, Mr. Toad? And he's like, I'm all right. You know what I mean? Like, that is Dr. Dolittle. Whereas animal handling is more like looking at that same toad and being like, oh, he looks, because of how he's acting and how he's standing there, like he's hungry or he's afraid or, he's guarding something. And so now I still am interacting with it as if it's an animal, but it kind of gives me a more empathic understanding of what the animal needs and or wants in that situation, which will then allow me to act towards it in a way that will either, hopefully benefit me and not like accidentally scare it away or make it angry or what have you. If you have a skill like animal handling and you have a spell like Speak with Animals at the same time, then I mean, like, you're really in the money because you can, sort of get an inkling as to what the animal is going through and then be able to actually address it, like, with words. And so you're, like, really doing the most. But not all characters may have that union of skill and spell. Rangers most likely will, druids most likely will, but other characters may not, depending on how you build your character. Insight. So insight's an interesting one. Insight is, I love having insight on characters. It's not for everybody, but I love having insight on characters because it's very important I think, personally. Although, if you're, depending on how you're role-playing your character, I'm talking in circles. I'll tell you what it is first, and then I'll go back to my point. Insight is your ability, kind of like animal handling, to empathically understand what an animal might be wanting or feeling. Insight is like that, but for people. So, like, insight is like, I'm talking to the Duchess, because I already used her as an example before. And we're talking to her about her recent rendezvous with the Duke. And we say, well, we believe that the Duke was not where you said he was on the night of the 12th. We have some eyewitness reports saying that you're wrong. And the Duchess says, well, why would you believe them over me? I am the lady of this court, and I give you my earnesty, Insight is what allows us to look at her, and through her body language, her intonation, where she's looking, like, we can kind of know she's lying, or she's not telling the whole truth, or she's more nervous than she's letting on, or she's completely 100% accurate in what she's saying. So it's a way that the players can kind of get clues from the DM about the true intentions of another NPC in the game. So where I was going to with this before is, I think this is an incredibly useful skill to have on a character like a bard or any character that is going to kind of be your party's face, who's going to be interacting with characters that are, not the players. Because obviously, if you have a character who's really good at like persuading or deceiving or intimidating or all those like social interaction skills, it's also very powerful. It's a powerful boon to be able to like use them on someone and then be able to detect how they're reacting to you, or if what you're saying is landing on them, or like if they're telling you the truth, which will guide your methods moving forward. Because you can be persuasive all you want and like charm them. And if you're like charming and then you find out, you get that hint that they're lying to you, then you might want to change your tactics and say, okay, I'm catching you in the sly. Switch to intimidation. Like, I'm catching you in the sly right now. I know that you're not telling me the full truth. Like, what's up? So insight is more of that like person to person understanding. which I think is really cool for social characters. But to my other point that I was saying before, it can also be a character choice to not be very insightful. Like, there are people out there who are incredibly charming and, can woo and can sweet talk, but they also are just sort of oblivious to other people around them, and they just sort of like are operating on like sort of vibes and good luck. Which could be like a fun character to play. That could be like a fun trope to play. So in that instance, maybe you don't want insight. Maybe you're like, I don't care if I can tell what other people are thinking or saying or feeling, as long as like my character is like being noticed and being felt, right? But that is just like a character choice you have to make. But that is the insight skill, and it is bound to wisdom. Medicine. Medicine is such an interesting skill, because to me it feels like it should be an intelligence skill, because medicine is essentially it's like it's first aid. Like, it is someone just broke their bone, how do we reset it? Someone busted open, got stabbed, in their gut, and they're bleeding, and we got to patch them over. This person just accidentally ate a poison mushroom, how do we make sure it doesn't like completely fell them? That is medicine. So yeah, to me it always feels like it should be an intelligence skill, but maybe because like it's more about your understanding of, it's like innate knowing, so it's like how the body reacts and how the body would take to certain types of methodologies of healing. You can see it that way perhaps. Or even if you just have like a soothing demeanor, right, so you can help people through their pain. That's like a way to think about it. But anytime you're trying to apply any like tangible, non-magical first aid, and that's like an important distinction to make, because classes like the cleric and the druid and the paladin, all the ones that are named priests here, and like we talked about, classes that have healing spells but aren't priests, like bards and rangers, they will have spells like cure wounds or healing word, which will magically restore hit points instantaneously, like in that moment their bodies are mended. Medicine doesn't really work that way. Medicine, although it does have some abilities that can be tied to regenerating actual hit points, for the most part, it's usually for situations like if someone's like passed out or been knocked unconscious and you need to like bring them back to waking consciousness, or like once again manipulating poisons or effects within them. So it can't be like very reactionary and instantaneous healing for the most part. Some classes may have abilities that break that rule. But so it's a good thing to have, but I would not rely on it. Like if you're building your party of characters, once again, using these as guidelines, and then you're like, oh, well, like I'll be a ranger, and I'll just like have first aid. And that way ranger's a bad example because he actually does have healing skills. I'll be a rogue, because they don't have any healing skills that I know of. I'll be a rogue, and I'll just take first aid so that we still have someone who heals, even if we don't have a priest. It's not going to work out exactly the same way. You'll probably still find yourself in a bind where that does not help you. So, something to consider. But it is still a good skill to have for all of those storytelling reasons. And when you don't have access to like an instantaneous healing spell, you can still help out your friends. Perception. Perception in many people's eyes is probably one of the most important skills for a character to have. And I say that... well, I'll tell you what it is first. I keep like going into explanations before I like clarify the ability. Perception is your senses. It is your smell, your sight, your taste, all that stuff. It is your awareness around yourself, your awareness of your person. The reason why so many people think, and I mean, I'm not saying they're wrong, that this is probably the most important skill to have, is because it is often called for when you are trying to discern things like, do I see the monsters who are approaching us in stealth trying to ambush us on the roadside? I have to make a perception check to see if I beat their stealth check, to see if I notice them. It is used for things like, do I notice the secret tripwire that has been placed throughout the length of the hallway, which if I step on it will release the deadly contraption that's like designed to like kill trespassers. So it is a very important skill to have, to be able to avoid those dangers. That being said, I don't love it being like an auto pick for everyone, because once again, I'd like the characters to be diverse and like nuanced, and like everybody has, skills and all different things. So I sometimes, if my character concept does not fit the character having perception, even if it is an incredibly useful skill to have, like, statistically speaking, or like whatever, like if I'm looking at a min-max perspective, I will not take it. Because I just like there to be variance, and I like having other skills. But it is hard to argue that, like, it is incredibly handy to have in nearly all scenarios, and it is related to wisdom. So bear that in mind. And then finally, we have survival. So survival is interesting in that it is one of those skills which is kind of related to nature, but is a distinct subset. So whereas nature, once again, is like my intellectual understanding of the natural world, what kind of animals live in this area, what do they eat, what kind of trees grow here, what can we use them for. Survival is more like how do we take those materials and that knowledge and turn it into something like tangible and helpful, right? Like how, like, I see tracks in the ground. I might know those tracks are from a wolf because I know nature, but I might not know how to effectively track that trail, especially through like harsh terrain, or if it's after it's just rained or something like that. That would be survival. I might know, because of my nature skill, that certain plants, certain trees are really sturdy here and good for like construction, but being able to like improvise a lean-to or a shelter, or be able to build a suitable fire to like get us through a bad storm would be survival, right? So survival is kind of how we use our wood lore, right, to actually help us endure the elements, endure harsh situations. Isn't perception related to investigations, such as finding hidden traps, levers? Yes. Also, the Uncouther first-time chat, thank you for joining us. Pleasure to have you here as we talk about D&D character creation. First-time chatter. Yes, it is related to investigation, and this is sort of a... I don't want to say it's a hotly contested subject. But yeah, there's a lot of overlap between... Thanks, I'm trying to learn D&D and C&C at the same time. Oh, no, yeah, that would be a lot to put in your brain at once. Absolutely. Hopefully we can help guide you to some knowledge. Yes, perception investigation, there is a lot of overlap, and it's one of those things where every DM, I feel like, has a slightly different interpretation of like when one would be used in one scenario versus another. And I think if you're building a character specifically for a campaign, I think that's a worthwhile question to ask your dungeon master. Like to say like, hey, I'm building a character that like I want functionally at the table to be really good at spotting and like detecting traps, right? In your mind's eye, what skill would you most likely call for that, right? Because if you look in the rule books, especially in the expanded like books, like they've released so many alternative stat books at this point, splat books I should say, they have made some qualifications, whereas like you can use maybe, I think, investigation to help like disarm traps and things like that, because like you're using like, I guess, like context clues to be able to disarm the mechanism, and perception to help you like notice it at first. So it's like perception helps you notice, investigation helps you undo, right? But then you also get into the situation where like as a DM, I might say personally that maybe sleight of hand could be disarming the trap, right? Because to me it's like, oh, you're like being like really nimble and quick with your fingers to help you undo it. Or some DMs might even say you need to do a thieves tool check, right? Because that is a specific check you can make. Or some DMs, depending on the I think in, what was it? Xanathar's Guide to Everything, they talked about how skills and tools can work in tandem. And because, there is some overlap there as well that is not very well defined in the original rulings. They say it's possible that you could, if you have the relevant skill and you also have the tool, instead of making the raw tool check, like just a sleight of hand check, just a thieves tool check, maybe you make a sleight of hand check, but you now have advantage because you have the tool. So it's giving you a benefit to the check. So there's really a lot of variance into how those rulings can be made. And I think it really has to do with the DM's vision of the fiction and their consistent ruling, right? Because it is kind of frustrating if one trap, they're saying, okay, yes, everything is perception based and investigation to disarm. And then the next trap, you kind of get caught unawares and they're like, well, your investigation wasn't high enough. And it's like, well, that's not how it worked last time, So it is a conversation that I think is worth having with your DM because there is a lot of nuance there. But yes, you are correct in that perception and investigation are very closely related, especially in the realms of traps. I want to say, and I don't have the PDF open, I think the most recent clarification is perception to notice the trap and triggers, investigation to help you figure out how to undo it, and then another check to undo, likely a thieves tool check or a sleight of hand check. But to be honest with you, I condense a lot of the checks, or what I will do is I will make both investigation and perception applicable, but at different, because I personally as a DM, I like lowering the barrier of entry for my players. I like making multiple avenues of success possible. For example, if they were scaling a really high cliff or they were trying to climb up the side of a wall, right? You could say athletics, and the game rules would probably call you to say athletics because it is all about climbing and jumping. But I also offer characters the chance in my games to use acrobatics because I understand in the fiction of my mind that a person could scale a very difficult surface very quickly, not just through raw strength alone. You think about fiction, parkour, Assassin's Creed kind of stuff. Characters want to be able to do that too. That's probably the reason why they gave themselves acrobatics in the first place. So I want to reward that choice, right? I want to make multiple paths of success possible as I'm a DM. I'm not saying every DM will do that. So what I might do when it comes to the relationship to perception and investigation is I will make both applicable to detecting traps, but at different levels of distance and danger, right? So for example, maybe perception allows you to notice that trap trigger from farther away because it's more of a wide understanding of your surroundings, whereas investigation may be an easier check to accomplish, but you have to be a lot closer before you notice it because you're very finely tunedly paying attention to all the details of the world around you, right? As opposed to having a wider open lens, which could put you at different advantages or disadvantages depending on the trap, right? If it's a trap that you step on it and it explodes, right? It's going to be a lot more beneficial to detect it with perception than it would be investigation, or I should say, fail to detect it. Whereas maybe a trap where you trigger it, but then I'm thinking of in Bloodborne, I think it is, where you're walking through the woods and you step on that one pressure plate and it swings a spiked log from behind you. So it kills most players before they notice the first time. That may be something where being on the investigation side of it is better because if I'm up close and I'm triggering it, but it's swinging in from behind me, the person who would be trying to detect that same thing with perception from far back is now the first in line to get clobbered, right? So once again, highly variable depending on your DM and what scenarios they have planned, but I would just have that conversation ahead of time and just let them know this is the intent of my character. I want to be the party trap finder. So how do I do that in your game? right? And like kind of come to that agreement together and make sure that it is consistent, which is the biggest thing. So now that we've discussed all of the stats and the skills that are associated with them, we were kind of using the Bard as a template because that is the character type that Mochi was most interested in. Mochi is our inspiration for our build today. So going back to the point buy calculator, I'm going to use the standard array as our inspiration for building out the sample character. Rogues are better, lol. I do love a rogue. I'm currently playing a rogue in a friend's campaign who's like very Zorro inspired. He's a swashbuckler, but I also have a soft spot for bards. I already said like if I was a D&D character, I'd probably be a bard, but I do love rogues. I love having skills. I love having expertise in skills because I just love when my numbers are big. I like when the numbers are real big. I like rolling the dice and making them numbers go real tall. Which rogues are good at for skills. So let's use the standard array as our because we understand it is the most fair balance of the usual conceptions for making character, and it just gives us some guidelines to use as an example for building here. We should probably talk a little bit about, so you have, and this is where once again it gets a little noodly. I'm playing a Harengon rogue for my first character. It's awesome. Oh yeah, Harengons would be an excellent pairing for the rogue. You quick hopping little sly bun you. Harengon, for anyone who are not familiar, are like rabbit folk. They're like rabbit people. So you can imagine all of the dexterity of a hare in the able body of a man. And so they're very good at being rogues. Absolutely. So where are we at? Oh, we should talk a little bit about your ability score versus your ability modifier, because this gets people tripped up so much, and it's something that's going to come up in the game all the time. So we talked a little bit about when we're using. So let's use our. Okay. Number one, let's apply our standard array to this stat sheet, right? As we were making a sample character. So number one, we've already talked about how we're building a bard. Bard's primary spell casting ability is charisma. Bards do most of their effects via their spells, so we want their spell casting powers to be as good as they can be. With a standard array, the highest possible number that we can start in any one given stat is a 15. So let's just say, for argument's sake, we pump this up to 15. Whew, sorry, that 4 hours worth of water that chat made me chug is now getting to me. Now let's say, and I'm just gonna build out these numbers, Moch. I know we're using you as inspiration, but I'm gonna build out these stats, and then we can always change them as we're like going through the example. But just to give you an idea of how this works, I think it might be better if I just throw some numbers up here and then we talk through them. So let's say, yeah, I need really high charisma as a bard, so I'm going to put that there. Then we're going to say, you know what, my bard, is musical, and so obviously, like, has a lot of charisma to do the performance and the singing, but also, is a little lyrical with the body, is very nimble, is very graceful. So we're going to say my second highest stat is in dexterity, which is a 14, right? So I have a very strong control of my hand-eye coordination. I am graceful, I am lithe, all that stuff. Now let's say I am a bard, so I have studied different songs and different techniques and different instruments, so my mind is pretty sharp. So I'm going to say my next stat here is 13 for my intelligence. I am going to say what else here? We'll say that because my body's already pretty well trained in terms of dexterity, probably also makes sense that it's a little tougher, a little stronger than average. And we'll say that my constitution is just like straight up average, right? Sort of my body stats going down and increasing utility and usefulness. Like I'm very graceful. I'm kind of strong, but I'm only like somewhat hardy. And then my base stat, like my lower than average, is wisdom. I'm traveling around the world, singing songs, singing lullabies to monsters. You could argue that's not a very wise thing to do. So we're going to make that my dump stat, if you will. That's like a colloquial term if you're like new to D&D. A lot of people will say what's your character's dump stat? It's like their low stat that you don't touch, because once again, by having a low stat in one area, you can give yourself a few points to squeak out and get better stats elsewhere, right? So we'll say that wisdom's my dump stat. So these are my ability scores. These are the raw numbers that sort of show the building block of the character as it is. Over here, you're going to see something called the modifier, right? And you'll actually see that these numbers are different than the ability score. They're different to each other depending on what these numbers are, and they actually go up and down depending on these numbers. So for example, if I pump down strength by 2, bump, we see that went from 1 to 2. You see that there? Now, why is that, and why is the ability modifier important? So, as you may or may not be aware, playing D&D revolves around the rolling of a lot of die. And famously, the die that you will use the most is the D20. So it is a 20-sided die. The die represents fate and fortune, chance, chaos, right? Because it doesn't matter how charming our bard is, and this bard is particularly charming, right? There's always the chance that the beautiful performance you gave, the empowering speech you just displayed in front of the troops, whatever fiction you want to sell for like how you're using your charisma, there's always going to be the chance that it doesn't land, or you misspeak, or the person that you're speaking to has a heart of stone and is not moved by your performance, or at the same time that you give your rousing performance, there's suddenly a thundercrack overhead which drowns you out, right? These are like all narrative ways to describe like how rolling really poorly, right? Rolling like a 2 on your die versus a 20. Obviously, the higher the number, the better the result. The lower the number, the worse result, can be reflected in the fiction. So if the D20 is like the chaos, it is the random chance and effect of the world around you, then these numbers are the constants. These are like, I am always this charming, I am always this strong, I am always this nimble. But even though D&D is a numbers game, and it is a lot about maths, light maths, I'll give it that. We all know I'm not a math person. We discussed this at length already, but I still play a lot of D&D. There is math involved. But rolling, let's say, a D20 and then adding a 14, that would be very annoying math to do a lot, right? Like, I don't know about you, but like when I'm thinking about like doing 13 plus, 17 off the top of my head, I have to carry some mental 1s and 2s, and it's not very intuitive. It's not very fast. So the modifiers simplify things, and that the modifiers become those bonuses that you add to the rolls, right? So you can think about them when you say modifier. They are the thing that is modifying the roll of the D20. If these are the base stats, if these are the representations of how strong or how fast or how wise your character is, these are the actual numbers that are modifying the rolls that are based off of these constants. So they are directly related. But they're just making the math simpler. It's a lot easier to roll a die and say, what is 16 plus 2, right? 18. Than it is to say, what is 16 plus 14? And it also makes the math a little simpler to wrap our heads around in terms of design, right? I'm not a designer. I am a designer. I've designed things for D&D, but I'm not a part of the Wizards design team, right? D&D, from a DM's perspective, is all based around me having a number in my head that the characters have to beat with their rolls in order to determine failure or success, right? So in that example of giving a speech, if I know that this speech that the bard has to give to motivate the troops to battle, it's got to be good, because this army has seen defeat one too many times and their enemy is great, and the idea of marching into this fight feels like a suicide mission, right? I'm gonna need the character, the bard, to roll really well. Yes, the Uncouther. We are going to speak to how the ancestry bonuses and that affect these as well. Good point. We touched on ancestry a little bit, but we haven't done a deep dive yet, but that is definitely an aspect of it, for sure. So I know in my mind that, like, let's say I know I'm gonna need the bard to roll an 18 or higher to motivate this army into the fray. Once again, it's a lot easier for the character, the player, to roll a d20 and say, okay, I got a 16 plus a 2, that's an 18, versus like having to have a number like 34 or 38 or like whatever those like d20 plus like 15 would equate to, right? To be a success. So it just simplifies everything. The modifier is always the number that you add to things, add to rolls, add to attack rolls, add to ability checks, all that stuff. These numbers just represent the raw stats. Now, to Uncouther's point, so let's plug in a few of these here. So we know this is a 15. We know that this is an 8. We know that this is a 13. We know that this is a... what'd I say? 12. This is a 10. Or a 1 minus, which is not a thing. This is a 14. Yeah, that looks about what we said before. Are those mods also for the saving throws? Yes, they are. So what we can see here, especially on this character sheet, and certain character sheets are designed somewhat differently, but you can see that each ability score is tied to a set of skills, right? Everything under this umbrella, right? All these little skills and saving throws attached to the ability scores, they inherit the modifier. So if the strength 12 is a +1 modifier, then at base this gets a 1, this gets a 1. And that will be the number that you... So if as a DM say, you need to give me an athletic skill check or an athletic saving throw, it is a d20 plus whatever is right here, which in this case would be a 1. Now, there's one scenario in which this is slightly altered, and that is, let me see, is there a place for it on this character sheet? There is. There is a part of your character which is inherent. This cannot be taken away from you, and it is a part of every class, which is called your proficiency bonus. Okay? So proficiency bonus, as you can see, it starts off at +2 at level 1, and then increases as you advance in level, right? What proficiency bonus represents is your character's natural ability at just getting better at the things they're already good at over time. How proficient you are in something, proficiency bonus. So like naturally, if you have an aptitude for performance or an aptitude for history, it's assumed that as your character gets stronger, you will get better at those things. So we'll put proficiency bonus +2 in there because that's what we have as a level 1 bard, which I didn't write bard 1, but now I'll write bard 1. During the character creation process, you will have the opportunity to select some skills for your character to have. They are typically related to the class that you have chosen, and sometimes the background, which is another area that we haven't delved too deep into yet, but it is a contributing factor. So you can see for bards, under their proficiencies, they actually are they're known for being very skillful, very knowledgeable people that have a wide variety of talents. So they can actually choose any 3 skills that they want, right? There are certain classes that have much more stringent skill choices, right? Like fighters. Sorry, I had an ad. Where does the proficiency bonus come from? Because I'm asked to use that in a few of the sessions I've played and add it to my mod or saving throw. Good question. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. So, my brain. Okay, reset. You can see under Bard, under their proficiencies, they are stated to be proficient, quote unquote, in 2 saving throws, dexterity and charisma, and then they can choose 3 skills. So say, for example, let's go back to our Bard example here. So we know automatically that they're proficient in dexterity and charisma saving throws. This is inherent to the class. It does not change. Now, my choice as a player is I can choose any 3 skills as a Bard. So let's say, for example, I know that I want to be persuasive, I know that I want to be acrobatic, and I know that I want to know a lot about history, right? I want to know songs from the ages. So now we take a look at these modifiers. So what? I had, what are we looking at here? I had a 2 for here. Yeah, I had a 2. Whoa. Hello? You awake? There we go. 2. I had a -1. I had a 1. I had a 0. I had a 2, I believe, and a 1. Okay. So now, in all of those areas, I have an opening shift stuff to hop off now, but I hope you have an amazing stream. Oh, thank you, Bingo. I appreciate it. We're probably gonna close down soon because it is getting late, but we'll finish this discussion first. We'll break it up into a couple different sessions because it is a big task to unravel building a character. But thank you so much for joining. Good night, Bingo. Enjoy your shift tomorrow, early morning. So in all of these areas, which I've marked, right? My little character sheet let me select. This means I am proficient in that skill or that save, which means my proficiency bonus then is added to that, okay? So, direct example, my charisma score is 2. I am proficient in persuasion, so 2 plus 2, 4. Now, any d20 I roll related to charisma saving throws or persuasion checks is a +4. My other skills, which are still nested under charisma but are not trained, only receive the 2. Because it still gets the 2 because that's my charisma, that's my natural force of personality no matter what. But I'm not specifically trained in that skill. I'm not proficient in it. So I don't get the extra +2. But how do you get the proficiency bonus for +2? And can it go higher? It can go higher. So we'll take a look at the Bard again. Scroll back up. I want to say I could be lying to you, but I don't think that I am. The proficiency bonus track is actually the same for all classes. I don't think there is a class that skews from this progression. There are classes that toy with the proficiency bonus itself, like, for example, bards and rogues, because they get the feature expertise. They can actually double their proficiency bonus for certain skills, but that's like a whole other conversation. But for all classes in general, they follow the same track. So you can see every character, doesn't matter who you are, if you're a level 1 character, you have a +2 proficiency bonus. And this will actually not change until certain level thresholds are met. So it looks like it's level 1, level 5, level 9, level 13, and it tops out at level 17. Why this was done? If you take a look in the DMG, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there are certain thresholds for character levels which sort of inform the type of adventures that you're telling. They call it like the tiers of play, right? So you start off as like local heroes where maybe you're solving like quests for a town, like, clear out the rats out of the basement, deliver this message, whatever. Then you start progressing into local heroes, heroes of the land. So like you may now take quests for like larger lords, larger tracts of land. Maybe you're hunting down monsters over a frontier, that sort of thing. Then it's like masters of the world, where you're maybe helping kingdoms and you're helping entire fiefdoms and empires with their like city ending threats. And then finally I think it's like Lords, I forget all the titles, but the last one's like you're defending the entire world, right? Like you are defending from reality ending threats, gods, monsters from beyond. Those thresholds mark a character's evolution of strength, right? From fighting rats to fighting gods is a big jump. And those thresholds of where your proficiency bonus caps and goes up match those tiers of play. So the proficiency bonus is almost like a reflection of your character's aptitude, like as a hero, progressing over time. So like 1 through 4, right, those levels, even though they're very different levels, 1 through 4, you're still like in that first tier of play. You're still usually solving local problems, small scale kind of business. It's when you hit 5th level and go up that you start fighting a different level of threat. You're in like a new ball game, essentially. And accordingly, your proficiency bonus adjusts to replicate your newfound level of strength and aptitude as a hero. So the proficiency bonus is pretty straightforward because you know that it starts at +2 no matter who you are, and it only gets higher through just raw leveling, right? It's really the ability modifiers that are based off of your raw stats, your ability scores, which you as a player kind of have a more direct control over because you're the one who gets to say, yeah, I'll add a few more points here. I'll take a few more points away there. As I level up, I'll gain more, that sort of thing. That you have a direct, influence over, but proficiency bonus is static. The final point about ability scores, which we'll talk about since Uncouthor brought it up, is that there is one other element that does have a direct correlation to the ability score itself, and thus the modifier, and that is your ancestry. So we did talk a little bit about it earlier in the stream, how certain ancestries as written have natural proclivities or bonuses to certain ability scores, at least in the original text of the 5th edition rulebook. If you buy the original 5th edition rulebook, you'll see, like I think I used dwarves as an example before, dwarves are naturally have a bonus to strength and constitution. In subsequent rulings, as of Tasha's Cauldron to Everything, you have the option as a player, so long as your DM opts into these optional rules, where those stat bonuses are not inherently tied to your ancestry and can be applied to any ability score that you want, right? And they're doing that in hopes to A, make character builds more diverse, and B, to distance away from the idea that, like certain ancestries are just naturally better or worse than other things, making everything sort of more equal and open for everybody, which is great. I, as a DM, I always allow players to put the points wherever they want, just because I like the idea that it's more inclusive, and I like the idea that I can be an orc wizard. That's cool. And normally, I could still be an orc wizard without the stat bonus before, but it does kind of suck that I'm not as good of a wizard starting off as, like, an elf wizard would be. Sometimes you just want to play a different type of character that has a different story than that ancestry might normally play. And so that open ruling allows you to kind of break open that shell a little bit. So, in accordance to all of that, we can actually use this calculator, I think, to look at some of the standard ancestry modifiers. So if we take a look at select here, they don't show us the bonuses. But you know what? We'll use dwarf as an example since we've used it a couple times. Although Moch, you will be the final say in what we choose since you are our inspiration. So if I click on dwarf, you will see that automatically, racial bonus, I get a little +2 to my constitution. So that original 10 has now gone up to 12, which means that 0 that I initially had as my modifier now gets pumped up to 1. So that's 2 free points. That's 1 free modifier point just from having an ancestor, just from being a dwarf. You'll also see here that I also have the option for a sub-race or a sub-ancestry. So just like how we talked about how most classes, eventually you'll gain a subclass, a specific type of class that is nested within the base features, ancestries are the same way. So most ancestries will have you have your over-archetype, like you're a dwarf, but you also might be a mountain dwarf, so you hail from, the towering stones across the landscape versus a hill dwarf, where you may live on the land with other folk across the countryside. You might also be a dwarf, I think they're the Dwergar, the deep dwarves, which live deep underground, which all have a different reflection on the ability modifier, at least once again, as written in the original text. These are all variable as of Tasha's Cauldron to everything. There are other reasons why you would want to be a variant, a different type of a sub-ancestry. So for example, if I'm not mistaken, one of the dwarf types, hill or mountain, I can't remember, they get a bonus to their, on top of the constitution bonus they also get bonus hit points. Whereas another one, I might be making this up. I'm forgetting which is based. You know what? I'll use elves as an example because they're much easier to remember. For example, a high elf learns extra spells. They gain extra cantrips, little bonus spells, because they're more magically inclined. Whereas a wood elf who grew up in the forest knows how to hide amongst the foliage better. They get abilities that help them blend in with the woods and the rain, all that stuff. That is divorced of any stat bonus they get. That's just a special quality, almost like a supernatural gift to that ancestry. So even aside from all of the numerical bonuses you might accrue from choosing one sub-ancestry over another, you also are getting other gameplay benefits. You're getting those kind of unique little additional powers that are on top. It's let's say, for example, what's Hill Dwarf? Hill Dwarf gives us a +1 to wisdom. Useful. Mountain Dwarf gives us +2 to strength. So you can see these are what affects the ability modifier. Once again, because I like playing that the numbers are divorced from anything, Moch, I know that there are so many ancestries in 5th edition. I'm looking at the list right here, and I don't expect you to know all of them at all. But, if you could imagine yourself, and you don't even have to use D&D terminology. If I ask you if you could be a fantasy creature, a fantasy person, what would you want to be? And you tell me a mermaid. I'm sure there is a mermaid type ancestry here, which we can apply. Just a dwarf. I want to be pretty. Oh, you're not saying dwarves are pretty? I'm sure there's some very lovely, lovely dwarves out there. If Rings of Power, Deesa's pretty. She has a great singing voice. Bard, but I'm sure there is. But yeah, so what are your inclinations when I say be any type of fantasy creature you would like to be? There are lots of pretty ones. Elves are your standard pretty boys and pretty gals. Aasimar can be pretty. Those are like humanoids with celestial blood. If you tune in on Wednesdays when we normally run the 5th edition live campaign, one of our cleric, actually one of our players, is an Aasimar. So she has divine blood running through her. So because they have like angelic divine ancestry, they're usually pretty. You know? What else? Elf is the only thing that comes to mind because Legolas. Oh, Aasimar. Aasimar. Also on the flip side, tieflings. If you watched me play through the Baldur's Gate. Oh no, no, you don't have to say oops. That is a very common joke. You know, a tiefling is what I played in the Baldur's Gate beta, where I was like sort of like a demon-blooded person, a devil-blooded person, and you know I mean, hey, depending on all flavors, all folks are different strokes of folks. Tieflings are kind of hot, but yeah, it could be a bugbear. You just be a big, hairy goblin person. Hot to somewhat. Everyone's got their own taste. But if you're saying that you think elf is like classic cutie, then we can slap elf on there. You can also say half elf. You know, be half human or half other humanoid, half elf. Get a little bit of both worlds. Sea elf, yeah, if you want to go mermaid but still have a little elf in you. That's also an option. Tons of stuff. But if you wanna use elf as like the foundation, we could do that too. That's all right. I'm gonna go with Aasimar. Ooh, I like it. I actually played an Aasimar cleric in a play-by-post game who I loved. He was obnoxious. His name was Razhael the Radiant, and because he was an Aasimar bard, so he had divine blood. He believed himself to be the direct descendant of, I forget the name of the god of this point, but like the god of music and art. So like he quite literally believed he was one of the gods' gift to song, and he made sure that everyone knew it. And what was really annoying was he was really good at what he did, so even though he was just terrible to deal with, like he had the biggest ego, he like actually could back it up with all of his like skill and magic, so he was infuriating for everyone to deal with. But I mean, he always meant well. He was a bard. He was always healing people and helping people. He just wanted to make a big show of it. He was a flashy boy. Razhael the Radiant was his name. So what's cool about the Aasimar is, once again, we are playing with the idea, went to Good Omens 2 during NYC, and I'm on a Neil Gaiman kick. Oh, hell yeah. Okay, I like the inspiration behind that. Yeah, I just updated my Goodreads with all the books that I want to slam through. Yo, I converted a list of books that I've been saving up on my phone into Goodreads, which is like 170. It's like a lot of books. And I divided that. I was like, okay, if I read 2 books a month, ad nauseum, forever, right? How long is it going to take me to read all these books? And I'm currently sitting at 7 years. So I got a lot of reading to do in this lifetime. That didn't throw me into an existential crisis at all. My head's not spinning thinking about that gap of time. But yeah, so we have some Neil Gaiman on that list for sure. Gaiman on that list for sure. Okay. Cool thing about Aasimar is their subtypes are like very unique and like very cool because, you know, they're celestially blessed by like otherworldly forces, so their powers that they get from that are very cool. Some of them are the same. All Aasimar, I think, are able to conjure light and do healing to a certain extent, which, you know, we'll factor in later. We're mostly worried about the stat bonuses right now. But the 3 main differences between these Aasimar, because the Aasimar that's labeled as DMG was like the prototype Aasimar from the handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, which isn't like official anymore. These are the 3 main ones. The Protector Aasimar can channel their divine magic and they can grow a pair of wings. And when they do that, of course, they can fly, which is awesome. But they also imbue all of their spells and attacks with extra magical light damage for like a short amount of time. So that's what Raziel did. Raziel was just like, you want to hear my song? Well, first, let me fly above the battlefield and bless you with it. And then they would just like shout magical curses at people and they would like be seared. He's bad. He's badass. That's Protector Aasimar. Scourge Aasimar are like, it's like you want to purge the world of darkness. When you trigger your celestial blood, you emanate a light around you, an aura that is so blinding and burns so bright that it not only sears the people who are around you, but it also sears you as well. So it's sort of like a double-edged sword. You are burning away the wicked, but you're also sort of like scouring yourself in the process. And the Fallen Aasimar are the spooky Aasimar. Those are for if you want to be an Aasimar, but you got an edge. The Fallen Aasimar are, I mean, you could narratively justify this many ways. In the book, they say that Fallen Aasimar are Aasimar who were selected by a god. You know, they have this like godly blood or like angel blood or whatever. But for whatever reason, they've turned away from their divine calling or their path. So it reflects in their supernatural power. You could also, I would argue that you could do a Fallen Aasimar as maybe like an Aasimar who has the bloodline of like maybe a more sinister deity. So even if they're not evil, right? Because once again, we know that Aasimar can choose their path. Like, they can be born by a blessed being and still turn away from it. So the opposite, I believe, is true, where they could be born from, like, maybe a darker influence, but still choose light, right? So maybe you could argue that, like, you're a Fallen Aasimar, like, your powers are given to you from a dark force, but you are still, you know, a force of good. Despite that, Fallen Aasimar, when they manifest their power, they also manifest like wings, but they're sort of like dark and creepy, like dark angel wings or like spooky, maybe bat wings. And when they do that, it actually radiates an aura of fear. So they don't get to fly from it. They're still terrestrial. But anyone who gazes upon them, at least I think, if I'm remembering that correctly, they're still bound to the ground. But when they unveil them, everyone who gazes upon them are like struck with supernatural fear, and that makes them want to turn away from you and not combat you. That's actually a cool one because you can use it like in combat and out of combat. Like if you need to intimidate people into like doing something for you, you know, it's hard to turn away someone who can suddenly manifest like the vestiges of some dark power within them. You'd be like, oh yeah, I should probably listen to what you have to say, huh? So out of those three, are any like just calling your name, just like making you wanna sing a song? Want to be a Fallen Aasimar with light? That's totally possible. Yeah, absolutely. That's another thing too, where it's like, you know, it's all about working with your DM on selling the fiction. My goth side wants this. Yes, embrace the goth. It's all about working with your dungeon master to justify, you know, your narrative choices and your character concept in their game world. Like, if you were to come to me as your DM and say, like, I want to have the powers of a Fallen Aasimar, but I want to have, like, light, in my mind, I'm almost thinking of that, like, scene in Lord of the Rings when, like, Galadriel starts talking about, like, how powerful she'd be, you know, if she had, like, the ring, and she's, like, emanating with all that power, and, like, she's scaring the shit out of Frodo. Like, I would be like, yeah, absolutely. Like, that, I love that. Yeah, but you know, some DMs, I don't know. It seems kind of like it'd be kind of a wet blanket if they were like, well, it doesn't make sense in my world. But I mean, you know, it's worth having that conversation with them so that you're aligned on the fiction and the function of the character. So, like, okay, if we were to add Fallen Aasimar to this character, singing a scary story and no one gets frightened, but yo, I mean, honestly, that's cool. Like, you're singing like a spooky, scary. I mean, this is the season, right? Halloween. You sing a spooky, scary song. No one buys it. You're like, let me kick this up a notch. Why am I suddenly getting the Hex Girls from Scooby Doo? You know, we're the Hex spells that we're gonna put a spell on you. Anybody remember that? Was it just me? Was that just my Orcure song? Oh my god, this poor bard. Just so many like goth emo influences, just like alt influences. Okay. So we are seeing, we can naturally see here that the Aasimar Bard gets a +2 bonus to charisma, which is like exactly what we want, right? We want our strongest stat bonus to be in charisma. To put this into perspective, the highest stat that a character can obtain just through natural leveling, just like by getting better as a standard character, is 20, right? So starting the game with 17 puts you 3 away from max. I keep looking at chat over here. I have a habit of that. Camera's here. Being 3 away from max is like incredibly powerful to start. There are certain characters that break this rule, but it's usually very far down their leveling path. Like I know barbarians can go above 20 strength and con, but that's only when they're max level. Most characters top out at 20. Let's see here. If Aasimar, it gives +2 to Ka and sub gives strength, wouldn't you want to move your attribute points around to balance it out? Like maybe switch out Dex and Ka. A totally valid point. This is where, and this is something that most players will get a feel for in time with building their character. Because like when I'm building a character now, I'm not building the character in my mind. I'm not building that character at level 1. I'm building that character as like much farther down their leveling track. Like I'm building the characters I envision them. I mean, I'll say at level 20 because I've definitely built out a character level 20. Whether or not they reach that point is another question. But because you are gaining stat points as you progress, and you're also gaining other abilities like maybe feats, which we haven't talked about, but that'll probably be for a separate video. Feats, which can also grant you attribute points. You can sort of see your character holistically as like not just where they start at, but where they will end at, right? You'll get a sense for that over time as you build multiple characters. So to your point, if let's say we are, what's the word? We are looking at this character right now, and we are saying we're not gonna change the stat boosts. Like we're not gonna free up the strength bonus to somewhere else. Like you technically can, since Tasha's come out, we're gonna keep it in strength. Then yeah, you could look at your stats at this point and say, you know what, my bard actually, I'm not imagining them being much of a melee fighter, so having this 13 in strength actually doesn't benefit me. Maybe I'll actually pump this strength down 1, so it actually remains the 12 that we always had, but maybe I'll give myself an extra, I can't give myself an extra point of intelligence because that breaks the point by. But you know what I mean? You do have the ability to, from this point, start noodling around with the numbers a bit. It's going to be your choice whether or not you want to bump down something like your main stat. One reason why I might suggest against, what was the suggestion here? Switching out Dex and Ka. Although it might still be justifiable. So we talked a little bit before about how certain certain ability scores have like breakpoints for the modifiers, right? So like it's usually every 2 points. So if I reset all of these, you'll see that 8 is a -1, 10 is a 0, 12 is a 1, 14, 2, and then I can't put this to 16 because 15 is the max. But you get it. If I were to hit 16, that would push my ability modifier to +4, right? Because the ability modifier is the thing that you're adding to all the rolls, that's the number that you want to push, right? You ideally you want to try to get even numbers in the stats that you want really strong, because that is what eventually modifies your modifier. That's what makes your modifier better. So like in the example, let's use your example for a second. Let's say I wanted to do the inverse. Let's say I wanted to make a bard that was actually really good at beating people up with like a weapon. And let's say, for argument's sake, that it is a strength weapon, because we get a natural bonus to strength here. It may be beneficial to put the 14 here, because with the +2, we still end up with the 16 that gives us our +3, right? So there's no functional difference between having a 15 and a 14, because that still is within the odd number range. That still gives us a +3 bonus. But there is a benefit from having a 15 here, because that +1 pushes us into the next even number, the next tier, to give us the +3. You know what I'm saying? So that pushes us over the breakpoint. Now you could argue that maybe, and once again, this is something that you'll get a sense for when you start building characters longer term, right? Maybe it's more beneficial to start fully loaded with charisma, because maybe that means after one ability score buy, right? That gets me to 18. Like, I could buy a feat maybe that gives me a +1 to charisma and a really cool special ability. So within one level, I can get my +4 and have a cool ability on top of that. Or maybe, I had a 13 in this stat. Maybe as I'm leveling up, I'll just buy a +1 here and +1 there in my next level. So I push both of those stats into the next tier, right? With just one level up. So there is some nuance. It really depends on the long-term plans of your build and of your character. But that is true. After you've applied your ancestry bonuses, it can be worthwhile to re-examine where your current stat bonuses are and then adjust accordingly, because you can sort of end up with an entirely different end result. End with a different end result, obviously, since you have proficiency in Dex. Yeah, and that's true. Another thing too to keep in mind is where your characters are proficient. Now, granted, because your characters, because they do have a proficiency bonus in dexterity, that will always naturally be higher. So maybe you could also argue too, maybe you want a higher score in something you're not proficient in, so you kind of balance it out as opposed to front loading it. But once again, that's up to character choice. I think that's also up to the narrative of your character, right? Like, for example, when I build a character, like if I were to build a wizard per se, and in my fiction, I know that I want the wizard to be incredibly smart, because that makes sense for being a wizard and that makes sense for his lore. I might put the 15 in there, even if it doesn't really make sense getting the +2 for that character concept, just because when I look at the paper and I see that his highest stat is intelligence, I just like that. As a player, that makes me feel smart. That makes me feel like I'm playing the character my way, right? It's all justifiable, right? But once again, that's going to be your personal choice and the nuance of how these stat bonuses get applied to you and your scenario. So I guess, Moch, this is kind of like our big deciding moment here. So we know that the bard's going to need charisma because the bard's going to be doing song stuff no matter what. But in your eyes, how does this character, this Fallen Aasimar, contest their enemies? Is it purely through magic and song? Do you imagine them using any weaponry? And if so, is it up close and personal? Is it maybe at a distance? Because this will ultimately shape, the rest of the rounding for the stats. Roll 3d6 Mochi 6. Yeah, we talked about the random roll method. Woof. Although, hey, I mean, some people still swear by it. I played a lot of games back in college in 3.5 where random roll, up close and personal fighting. Okay, which means we are gonna naturally put that strength bonus to use. So yeah, in this scenario, to Uncouthor's point, it may be beneficial to do something like 14 charisma, so you still get that 3 modifier. 15 here, because that +1 gives you the 16. Oh, I guess, well, That's another question too, because up close and personal fighting can go one of two ways. There are weapons that rely on strength, which by definition your character does have a natural bonus too, right? If we're not playing with the stat bonuses, which you technically could, right? There are weapons, though, however, even melee weapons, even up close and personal weapons, that rely on dexterity. Things like daggers, things like rapiers. You know, when you're dueling with something quick and nimble versus something raw. Yes, so rapiers, yes. There are certain weapons also want dexterity because I like acrobatics. We love to see it. Yes, to answer your question on Kuther, so any weapon that has the finesse property is interesting because it has the option to use dexterity. I believe it is worded in such a way that you can use either. Let me see. I'd like to know. Yeah, a weapon with the finesse property allows you to use your dexterity modifier instead of strength. And yeah, and then it says right here, finesse weapon with the thrown property can also use dex. So it's interesting because you can technically be a strength-based rapier wielder, but most people will probably build dex-based because it fits into the fiction, and that's kind of why that property exists for the rapier. You know what I mean? It exists so that you can have a decent melee weapon that is primarily founded on your dexterity to give you that option, because there's already so many great strength-based weapons for the heavy hitters, right? Swords and axes. So it does give you that flexibility. So yeah, let's say, for example, so let's really think this through. If you like dex, so let's say we put the Mochi Smith or instrument doing bludgeoning damage. I mean, El Kabong, right? Wasn't that the the Hanna-Barbera cartoon with the horse that hit people with the guitar? That would be a sick character concept. So yeah, what you could do, you can't make anything go higher than a 15. Naturally. Unless you divorce the sorry, my brain. Unless you use the Tasha's rules where you could move this racial bonus 1 around from strength to dex. So you could do something like just put them all at 15. If only. That could be possible, the random roll. Let's say the wisdom stays low. Let's say we'll put a bit more 15, 13. You're going to need some that. Let's say it's this, right? So you're keeping that charisma high. You have a high dex. It doesn't push you into the next tier because you don't get that +1. Uncouth by standard, right down here, I don't know if you can see, it's a 27-point buy. Rules is written. Of course, different DMs may have adjustments to that, but it is 27 points as written. And earlier in the VOD, if you watch back, we talk about how those points are distributed because it's not always a 1-to-1 transference. The higher a stat gets, the more points it costs. So there is a bit of a, it's okay, fly solo, never a +1. Let's see, you could do that as well. Balance it out. Now that would make, with bonus reach, you could do that. The thing to bear in mind is if you want to, maximize dexterity moving forward, like next level up, you likely wouldn't be able to do it unless you invested all of your points into dex. Because if you were at a 14, that's 2 points away versus a 15, which is of course 1 point away. Once again, it's one of those future planning things, but you could do it that way as well. You can end up with 2 14s to balance out. So I guess, Moch, that's kind of your call if you would rather have a balanced strength and dex versus skewing maybe higher dex one strength. Do you like having the 14s match, or do you like having that 15-13? The crowd waits eagerly. Let's do 15-13. I like the way you think. All right, now bump that down. Perfect. Okay. The Uncuther says no. Uncuther, next time we'll build a more top heavy player. Let's see, we got 15, 13. Yeah, we'll give you the extra con because you definitely are going to be fighting up close, and you'll definitely need the extra health. Excellent. And so yeah, so you can see now all of these numbers would change. So all of these 4s, right, would now become 5s. And all the 2s would become 3s. Because the charisma bonus is picking up the extra update from the increased charisma. And then it gets applied the proficiency bonus. And that would apply through everything around here. So that is kind of how the stats work in accordance to the ancestry, which we can now add to the sheet. And I think from there, I think we might call it, because we're going on midnight, and I will eventually need to sleep. And also, because chat made me chug all that water, I desperately have to use the restroom. Oh my god, chat. I drank like 4 hours worth of water in less than a minute. But this is a great building block for the character, and we'll use this as our example moving forward. So I'm going to say Mochi Bard. I'm going to save that. So this is our Fallen Aasimar, our like goth metal melee bard, which we're going to be working with the characters next time. So next time, what we're going to talk about, because we've talked about a lot. We've talked about the classes. We talked a little bit about ancestry and how that plays into it, and how that affects the ability scores. And we talked a lot about the ability scores. Next time we'll talk about background, because background is another foundational part of the character and does affect things like skills and narrative. And then we'll try to fill in some of the actual functional aspects of the character sheet, like attacks and health and all that stuff. But hopefully that gave you a strong primer of the character building process thus far. As we've been at it for a while, we're going on three and a half hours. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. We had a bunch of people coming in and out today. We had another follower, Gorilla WF. Yeah, we had 3 followers gained today. Thank you so much. Oh, and Mochi, of course, thank you for coming to all of our games. Speaking of which, Wednesday nights are usually the 5th edition D&D campaign. We got 6 players plus me. It's a lot of fun. I'll double check the availability for this Wednesday to make sure everybody can make it. If for whatever reason we can't make a full session on Wednesday, then you can tune in for like the side project that I'm doing, which is the Cypher System solo RPG, which Mochi also watched, which is an entirely different setting, an entirely different character. It's just me GMing for myself using a GM emulator, which is very interesting, but it's all like a sci-fantasy story where I'm like an archaeologist, which has now been modified with liquid metal insides and a computer brain, and I'm on the run from robots, and I think a giant snow centipede just rose out of the ground. It's wild. But that will be our other project if we can't do the 5th edition campaign on Wednesday. And then tune in for random nights where I do things like this. Do some one-shots we can jump to. Uncuther, join the Discord, which should be linked to all of our stuff. It's very new. It's still fresh. But I am planning on hopefully doing one-shots and also turning the Discord into a play-by-post space on a long enough timeline. So, join the community. And follow us on all the stuff. But that's sort of our rough outline. Sometimes we'll do sessions like this, or you can see me play Baldur's Gate, the pre-release, and there's some other RPG adjacent video game content that I'd like to show as well. But right now we're pretty heavily into the TTRPG stuff, which is where I want to be anyway. But that being said, Thank you all for joining us and being along the ride for this character creation journey. I hope you really enjoyed it, and we'll be picking up with the Mochi Bard at a later date so we can fully discuss the character creation process. And I hope you have a wonderful night. So until next time, my intrepid heroes, enjoy the rest of your evening.